Hey there, tonight we're uncovering why it sucked to be a Roman charioteer. What you're about to discover is that behind the glamour of racing lies a brutal truth of short-lived glory and perilous danger. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Sunlight barely peeks over the horizon, but you're already up, feeling the chill of the morning air in your bones. As a Roman charioteer, your day begins before the city even yawns awake. Welcome to your life at the heart of one of Rome's most dangerous sports, where glory is measured in laps and survival. Well, that's just a bonus. First things first, you drag yourself out of your less than luxurious sleeping quarters. Forget the cushy life of an athlete you might imagine today. Your home is more akin to a cramped barracks shared with fellow charioteers and stable hands. Privacy, that's a luxury reserved for senators, not for someone who risks their neck at speed, topping 40 miles per hour in a wooden cart. As you lace up your leather sandals, the reality of your training regimen looms ahead. While the average Roman citizen might be enjoying a leisurely breakfast of bread dipped in olive oil, you're heading into the gritty underbelly of the Circus Maximus. This colossal arena, capable of seating over 150,000 roaring fans, is where you'll hone your craft. It's not just a race. It's a spectacle that makes today's Super Bowl look like a backyard barbecue. But before you hit the tracks, it's time for some muscle-crunching exercises. This isn't your run-of-the-mill cardio. We're talking about strength training that would make a modern-day CrossFit enthusiast break into a cold sweat. You need to be strong enough to control a team of 4 horses, each weighing about 1,000 pounds. That's the weight of a small car multiplied by 4. And guess what? They're all sprinting at breakneck speed, with you trying to keep them in line with nothing but reins and sheer willpower. The training ground is no pristine gym either. It's more like a dust bowl, with the air thick with the smell of sweat and horse manure. It's in this gritty arena that you perfect your skills, learning to balance precariously on a chariot no wider than a modern motorcycle. The stakes are high, one wrong move, and you're not just risking a skinned knee. A crash could mean broken bones, or worse, a one-way ticket to meet the guards. Speaking of guards, the Circus Maximus itself is a marvel. Picture a colossal stadium that stretches over 2,000 feet in length, more than 600 feet wide. It's a place where emperors and commoners sit side by side, united in their love for the thrill of the race. But don't get too starry-eyed about the grandeur. For you, it's not just a stage, it's a battlefield. And the crowds, they're as bloodthirsty as they are passionate. They want drama, they crave excitement, and they won't hesitate to boo if your performance doesn't meet their expectations. Forget the polite applause of a tennis match. This is ancient Rome, where the roar of the crowd can be as deafening as a thunderstorm. Miss a turn, and you'll be met with jeers. Win a race, and you'll bask in their adoration. It's a fickle love, as volatile as the horses you drive. Let's talk about those horses. These aren't your average plow-pulling steeds. They're bred for speed and ferocity, with a temperament to match. You spend as much time getting to know them as you do with the whip in your hand. Trust me, when you're hurtling around a track, with only a thin chariot between you and disaster, knowing how to read your horses is the difference between life and death. And then there's the ever-present specter of injury. A charioteer's life expectancy isn't long, and not just because of the constant threat of being trampled. The physical toll is brutal. Your body is a roadmap of bruises and scars, each telling a story of a close call or a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. Your back aches from the constant strain, your hands are calloused from gripping the reins, and your knees creak from the strain of balancing the chariot. After a grueling morning of training, you might grab a hasty bite, if you're lucky. There's no time to savor a meal when the races are looming. Your sustenance is as Spartan as your lifestyle, maybe some bread and cheese, washed down with watered-down wine. It's not glamorous, but it keeps you going. As the sun climbs higher, the anticipation mounts. The Circus Maximus fills with spectators, the air vibrating with their excitement. It's a feast for the senses. The smell of roasted meats from vendors, the bright colors of team banners, the cacophony of voices blending into a single, overwhelming sound. You're not just a participant in this grand spectacle, you're its heartbeat. Let's not get carried away by the romance of it all, though. The rewards are great, but so are the risks. A successful career could make you rich, even famous, if you survive long enough to enjoy it. But for every charioteer who strikes it big, there are dozens more who meet a less glamorous end, trampled, maimed, or tossed aside like yesterday's news. So, as you stand at the starting line, heart pounding and adrenaline coursing through your veins, remember, you're not just racing for glory. You're racing for survival. Every lap completed is a minor miracle, a testament to your skill and courage. The chariot shakes beneath you, the horses snort and paw at the ground, eager to unleash their power. You grip the reins and brace yourself, ready to ride the line between triumph and catastrophe once more. As the dust settles and the roar of the crowd echoes in your ears, let's dive into the not-so-glamorous side of charioteering, the economics. Spoiler alert, it's not all fame and fortune on the chariot circuit. Sure, a few racers hit the jackpot, but for most, the financial outlook is as bleak as a Roman winter without a toga. First off, the cost of maintaining a team is astronomical. We're talking about a small fortune just to keep those four-legged speedsters in tip-top shape. Each horse needs to be fed, groomed, and trained, and let's not forget the occasional vet visit, when one of them decides to pull a muscle at the most inconvenient time. A single horse could set you back as much as 12,000 sestertii annually. Multiply that by 4, and you're looking at a hefty bill before you even factor in the cost of equipment and your own sustenance. And what do you earn for all this effort? Not much unless you're winning consistently. Your average charioteer might pocket around 15,000 sestertii a year, if they're lucky. That's barely enough to cover basic living expenses, let alone the care and feeding of your equine partners. In fact, many charioteers end up in debt, their earnings barely keeping them afloat as they chase that elusive big win. Now, let's talk about the stark contrast between the haves and the have-nots on the chariot circuit. The top racers, the ones whose names echo through the ages, they're in a different league. They're the Lewis Hamiltons of their time, rolling in cash, courted by sponsors, and living the high life. Diocles, one of the most celebrated charioteers, reportedly raked in a whopping 35 million sestertii over his 24-year career. That's more than the GDP of some Roman provinces. But for every Diocles, there are countless others who barely scrape by, their careers cut short by injury, or a lack of sponsors willing to gamble on an unknown. Speaking of sponsors, let's dissect this ancient system of patronage. Sponsors and patrons were the lifelines for many charioteers, providing the financial backing needed to compete. But this wasn't charity, it was a business transaction. Patrons expected a return on their investment, usually in the form of wins, and by extension, prestige. It was a relationship fraught with pressure, as a few poor performances could see a charioteer dropped faster than a hot coal. This economic backdrop fueled a win-at-all-costs mentality that was as dangerous as it was thrilling. Losing wasn't just a blow to pride, it was a financial disaster. The stakes were sky-high, and the pressure was relentless. In a world where a single race could mean the difference between financial ruin and a life of luxury, it's no wonder charioteers took insane risks. They pushed themselves and their horses to the edge, driven by the tantalizing promise of wealth and the fear of obscurity. But here's the kicker. The rewards often failed to outweigh the risks. Charioteering was one of the few careers where you could end up both a millionaire and a cripple. The life expectancy of a charioteer was brutally short, and not just because of the constant threat of being trampled or thrown. Physical demands and the ever-present specter of injury meant that many racers retired, or were forced to retire, long before they could enjoy any accumulated wealth. So why do it at all? Why risk life and limb, endure financial uncertainty, and face the prospect of an early grave? Because for all its dangers, charioteering held a seductive allure. The roar of the crowd, the thrill of the race, the chance to rise from obscurity to legend. It was a siren song few could resist. It was about more than money. It was about glory, about being remembered, about leaving a mark on the sands of time. And for those few moments in the arena, as you hurtled around the track, you weren't just a charioteer, you were a hero. Yet as you step off the track, the reality crashes back in. The cheers fade, the adrenaline ebbs, and you're left with the cold, hard truths of your profession. It's a life of constant peril, financial strain, and fleeting fame. But oh, what a ride it is while it lasts. So, until the next race, you'll nurse your injuries, count your coins, and hope that fortune favors you once more. While you're nursing those bruises and counting your coins, let's pull back the curtain on the political circus that was Roman chariot racing. You see, the Circus Maximus wasn't just a place for thrills and chills. It was a hotbed of political maneuvering and social engineering. Picture this: emperors and politicians using races as a sort of ancient Twitter feed to sway public opinion and keep the masses entertained, or at least distracted. In a city where bread and circuses were the currency of public approval, chariot racing was the ultimate political tool. Now, let's set the stage with some numbers. Rome's population at its peak was roughly 1 million, and with over 150,000 seats, the Circus Maximus could accommodate a hefty chunk of that. Imagine the political power of having such a captive audience. Emperors like Nero, who fancied himself quite the performer, understood the power of spectacle. He didn't just attend the races, he used them to advertise his imperial agenda. By sponsoring games, he could show off his generosity, or should we say, the state's generosity, since it was really public money, and keep the citizenry in a state of amiable distraction. But it wasn't just the emperors playing this game. Senators and aspiring politicians would sponsor races to curry favor with the populace. Think of it as a political campaign on steroids, where instead of endless TV ads, you had the roar of the crowd and the thrill of the race. Sponsoring a successful charioteer could endear you to the masses faster than a free-grain dole. It was a savvy way to build a base of support, and in a world without social media, word of mouth in the Circus Maximus was as good as it got. And let's not forget the factions. Ah, the factions. Those passionate, almost tribal groups of fans who supported their teams with a fervor that would make modern sports fans look like casual observers. The 4 main factions, the Reds, Whites, Blues, and Greens, weren't just about team spirit. They were deeply ingrained in the political and social fabric of Rome. Imagine if your favorite sports team was also a political party, social club, and sometimes a gang. Welcome to factionalism, Roman style. These factions weren't just about cheering for charioteers. They had real political clout, often aligning with certain politicians or causes. The Blues and Greens, for example, were the most influential and had a rivalry that stretched beyond the track. This wasn't just about winning races. It was about dominating the social and political landscape of the city. Riots weren't uncommon, and in 532 AD, the infamous Nika riots erupted from a chariot race dispute, nearly toppling Emperor Justinian. But why did the public care so much? Why did these races hold such sway over the Roman psyche? Well, in a society where social mobility was about as likely as finding a vegan at a Roman feast, the races offered a chance to dream. Charioteers, many of whom were slaves or from the lower classes, could rise to fame and fortune, challenging the rigid social order. It was a tantalizing narrative for the average Roman. If a charioteer could make it, maybe, just maybe, so could they. Moreover, these races were a microcosm of Roman life, dangerous, unpredictable, and thrilling. They mirrored the chaotic nature of Roman politics and the cutthroat arena of public life. In a city where power dynamics could shift as suddenly as a chariot veering off course, the races were a perfect metaphor. They showed that with skill, luck, and a bit of divine favor, you could come out on top, but one misstep, and it was curtains. Let's not gloss over the social norms influenced by this spectacle. The races blurred the lines between classes, if only temporarily. In the stands, a senator might find himself shoulder to shoulder with a commoner, both united in their support for the same faction. It was one of the few places where the rigid Roman social hierarchy seemed to loosen its grip, if only for the duration of a race. It's not that the barriers disappeared, but for a brief moment, the thrill of the race trumped the societal divisions. Of course, this wasn't all sunshine and chariots. The violence and fanaticism bred by these races often spilled into the streets. Fans could be as ruthless as the racers they supported, leading to brawls, riots, and even political assassinations. It was a double-edged sword for the emperors and politicians who wielded the races as tools of control. They were powerful, yes, but also volatile, a constant reminder that the crowd that hailed you one day could turn against you the next. In the end, chariot racing was more than just a sport. It was a social phenomenon, a political tool, and a reflection of Roman society's complexities. It offered a window into the hopes, fears, and ambitions of Rome's people, from the lowliest slave to the mightiest emperor. As we prepare to dive deeper into this world, remember that every cheer, every crash, every victory was more than just entertainment. It was history in the making, a testament to the enduring human desire for glory, power, and the occasional escape from reality. Buckle up. Our ride through the ancient world's most thrilling sport is far from over. And speaking of history in the making, let's shatter the myth of the Charioteer as a glamorous superstar living the high life. Sure, those guys were the rock stars of ancient Rome, but the reality of their lives was more behind the music than MTV cribs. Picture Gaius Apuleius Diocles, often touted as the Michael Jordan of charioteers. The man raked in a staggering 35 million sestertii over his career. Sounds impressive, right? That's more than even the most well-heeled Roman senators could dream of. But don't let the eye-popping figures fool you into thinking it was all parties at the villa and endless goblets of wine. First, let's talk privacy, or rather, the lack of it. As a charioteer, your life was anything but your own. You lived under a microscope, much like today's celebrities, followed by a relentless paparazzi. Except in ancient Rome, it wasn't just about snapping unflattering toga shots. It was having every move scrutinized by fans, rivals, and sponsors alike. Your victories were celebrated with gusto, but your failures, let's just say there was no shortage of people ready to remind you of them. And then there's the pressure. Oh, the pressure. Winning wasn't just a nice-to-have. It was your ticket to survival. You were only as good as your last race, and the crowd's memory was short. One misstep, one bad turn, and your name could vanish from the public consciousness faster than a Roman candle. The stakes were sky-high, and the stress was enough to make even the toughest gladiator break into a sweat. Diocles might have been rolling in sestertii, but he also had the weight of 1,000,000 expectations on his shoulders every time he stepped into the arena. Let's not forget the fleeting nature of fame. In a world without social media to keep the flame of celebrity burning, even the most beloved charioteers could find themselves yesterday's news in the blink of an eye. The public was fickle, and the next big thing was always just around the corner. Fame, like the chariots themselves, was a fast-moving beast, and staying in the public eye required constant victories and the kind of charisma that could charm the sandals off a Roman senator. So, what did a day in the life of a celebrated charioteer really look like? Let's take a closer look at our buddy Diocles. By the time he retired at 42, a ripe old age for a charioteer, he had raced in over 200 races, winning 462. That's more than a race every other day for nearly a quarter of a century. Talk about a grueling schedule. And while he might have been celebrated in the streets, behind the scenes it was a never-ending cycle of training, racing, and trying to stay one step ahead of the competition. Now, you might think the rewards of such a grueling lifestyle would come in the form of lavish homes and endless feasts, but the truth was more mundane. Sure, Diocles had his moments in the sun, but for most charioteers, the reality was far less glamorous. The top tier might earn a fortune, but many others scraped by, their winnings barely enough to cover the costs of maintaining their horses and equipment. It's a bit hard to enjoy your celebrity status when you're counting sestertii to pay for oats and horse grooming. And then there were the injuries. Charioteers were no strangers to the physician's table. The physical demands were punishing, with crashes, falls, and the constant jarring of the chariot on the track taking a brutal toll. Diocles himself, despite his legendary status, was no stranger to the healer's knife. Each race was a gamble with fate, and the odds weren't always in your favor. But what kept them in the game? What drove men like Diocles to risk life and limb despite the dangers and the stress? Maybe it was the intoxicating roar of the crowd, the thrill of the race, or the tantalizing taste of victory. Or perhaps it was the hope of securing a legacy, of leaving a mark in history that would echo through time. Fame may have been fleeting, but the chance to carve your name into the annals of Rome was a siren call few could resist. So, while the myth of the glamorous charioteer might persist, remember that behind the bright lights and roaring crowds was a life of relentless pressure, constant danger, and fleeting glory. It wasn't all laurels and luxury. For every Diocles basking in the limelight, countless others toiled in obscurity, their dreams of victory as ephemeral as the dust kicked up by their chariots. As we leave behind the arena of public perception, and dive deeper into the gritty realities of charioteering, keep in mind that the story doesn't end here. There's more to uncover about the lives of these daring athletes, the challenges they faced, and the legacy they left behind. So hold on tight, because our exploration of the ancient world's most thrilling sport is far from over. All right, folks, let's hit the brakes on the chariot and shift gears to the decline of this adrenaline-pumping sport. Why did the roaring engines of ancient Rome sputter out, leaving only dust and echoes? Well, buckle up, because the decline of chariot racing is a tale of economic woes, political shifts, and a society that, quite frankly, had other things on its mind. First, let's talk economics. By the time the Western Roman Empire was gasping its final breaths in the 5th century, the economy was about as stable as a chariot wheel after a 10-lap race. The state coffers were bleeding dry from constant warfare, and funding lavish games became less of a priority and more of a luxury that Rome could no longer afford. Maintaining the Circus Maximus was no small feat, and without the financial backing, the grand spectacle started to dim. Politically, the empire itself was cracking like a worn-out chariot axle. As Rome's political power waned, so too did its ability to use games as a tool of control. Why bother organizing a race when your empire is splitting like a Roman toga caught on a sharp corner? The once mighty Circus Maximus, which had been a center for political propaganda and public appeasement, began to lose its luster as a political tool. When the barbarians are literally at the gates, even the most die-hard fan might decide it's time to put down the racing program and pick up a sword instead. Socially, the bread and circuses that once kept the populace entertained were no longer enough. The social fabric of Rome was unraveling, and with it, the fervor for chariot races. As Christianity gained a foothold and spread across the empire, the appetite for blood sports shifted. The new faith frowned upon such displays of excess and brutality, advocating for more pious pursuits. It's tough to justify a charioteer's split-second decisions when the message of the day is about turning the other cheek. But don't be fooled into thinking chariot racing simply fizzled out overnight. Like any good Roman drama, it was a slow burn. The Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, kept the chariot wheels turning for a while longer, with the Hippodrome of Constantinople serving as the new beating heart of the sport. Yet even there, the sport was more a shadow of its former self. By the 6th century, the infamous Nika riots, which erupted right from the stands of a chariot race, nearly toppled Emperor Justinian. This was a clear sign that the sport's ability to unite and entertain had taken a dangerous turn, threatening the very stability it once bolstered. So, what's left of the charioteer's legacy? For one, their stories continue to capture imaginations. Why else would Hollywood churn out epics like Ben-Hur, complete with its iconic chariot race scene that still gets hearts racing? There's something eternally captivating about the image of a lone charioteer fighting against the odds, defying death with each turn of the wheel. It's a classic underdog tale, and who doesn't love rooting for the underdog? Yet, the reality was starkly different from the romanticized versions we consume today. Charioteers were more like the daredevils of their time, gambling with fate in a sport that offered little mercy. Their lives were precarious, their successes often fleeting, but it was precisely this dance with danger that etched their tales into the annals of history. The mythos of the charioteer as a hero battling not just the competition, but the whims of fate, continues to resonate because it taps into a universal human desire to triumph against all odds. In the end, chariot racing was more than just a sport. It was a mirror of Roman society itself. It reflected the empire's grandeur and its decadence, its political machinations, and its societal shifts. The decline of chariot racing echoes the fall of Rome, both victims of their own excesses and the unstoppable march of history. Yet, like the dust clouds they left behind, the legacy of charioteers lingers, a reminder of a time when the roar of the crowd and the thrill of the race were enough to make a mere mortal feel like a god, if only for a fleeting moment. In the misty haze of Scandinavian fjords, where the air is as crisp as a freshly minted Viking axe, Norse mythology was born. Now, before you get swept away by visions of Thor, Loki, and a world teetering on the edge of Ragnarok, let's talk about the reality behind these epic tales. The Vikings, those seafaring Norsemen from the late 8th to early 11th century, were the storytellers of their time. Think of them as the original podcasters, minus the tech, and with a lot more axes. Scandinavia during the Viking Age wasn't just a collection of snow-covered lands filled with berserkers and longships. It was a patchwork of tribal societies bound by familial ties, shared beliefs, and a penchant for storytelling as intense as a modern Netflix binge. The era was defined by its oral traditions, where stories passed down the generations were as valuable as gold coins. Though, let's be honest, those shiny coins were pretty important too. Now, let's talk about the Poetic Edda, the go-to source for all things Norse mythological. It's essentially the Viking version of a bestseller, only instead of being penned by a single author, it was a community effort. These oral poems were eventually compiled in the 13th century by Snorri Sturluson, a name that sounds like it could belong to a Game of Thrones character, but is in fact a real Icelandic historian and poet. The Poetic Edda wasn't just a collection of bedtime stories. It was the manual for understanding the cosmos, the gods, and how to navigate this chaotic world. The Vikings were masters of oral tradition, and they knew a thing or two about keeping an audience engaged. They weren't just spinning yarns around the campfire for fun. These stories were tools for teaching values, explaining natural phenomena, and instilling a sense of identity. In an era where literacy was as rare as a solar eclipse, word of mouth was the lifeline of culture and history. The Vikings' storytelling prowess was so legendary that if Yelp had existed, they would have had 5-star reviews for their captivating narratives, assuming, of course, they didn't raid the review site first. Their myths were filled with larger-than-life characters and dramatic events, but they served a practical purpose too. They explained why the world was the way it was. When a thunderstorm rolled in, instead of checking the weather app, Vikings would regale each other with tales of Thor riding through the sky in his chariot. This was the Norse explanation for thunder, Thor's hammer, Myeongseong, striking the heavens. It was a way to make sense of the uncontrollable and mysterious forces of nature. Today we might use science, but back then, myth did the trick. But let's not romanticize it too much. The Vikings didn't just sit around weaving tales for fun. They were also very much in the business of survival. Scandinavian life was harsh, with long winters and limited resources, which meant that practicality often trumped poetry. Myths were not just entertainment. They were survival guides wrapped in allegory. For example, tales of Odin sacrificing an eye for wisdom underscored the importance of knowledge, a valuable asset in the unpredictable and often brutal Viking world. The political and social landscape of Scandinavia during the Viking Age was just as dynamic as their myths. It was a time of chieftains and jarls, the movers and shakers of their society, who used these stories as a means to consolidate power and influence. A good story could unite clans, inspire warriors, and even justify a good old-fashioned raid on a neighboring land. The Vikings were not just marauders. They were savvy politicians and traders, navigating a complex network of alliances and rivalries. In this way, Norse mythology wasn't just a collection of dusty old tales. It was a living, breathing entity that evolved with the people who told it. Every storyteller added their own flair, ensuring that no two versions were quite the same. Much like a game of historical telephone, the core elements remained, but the details were subject to change based on the teller's whims and the audience's needs. So, why do these myths still capture our imagination today? Perhaps it's the larger-than-life heroes and villains, or maybe it's the allure of a world where gods walked among men and destiny was etched in runes. Or perhaps, just like the Vikings, we love a good story that helps us make sense of the chaos around us. Whatever the case, Norse mythology offers us a window into the minds of those long-gone Viking storytellers, who knew that a well-told tale was as powerful as any sword. Speaking of those Viking storytellers, let's dive into the fascinating socio-political alchemy that brewed these myths into a potent concoction of divine PR and very earthly power plays. Picture the Viking chieftains, those charismatic leaders who were equal parts warrior, trader, and politician. They didn't just rely on brute strength to rally their followers. They wielded mythology like a double-edged sword. Think of them as the original influencers, using tales of gods and heroes to craft narratives that bolstered their authority and justified their exploits. Take Thor, for instance. Sure, he was the thunder god with a penchant for hammer throwing, But he was also a symbol of power and protection. In a world where lightning could set your longhouse on fire faster than you could say, Myeongseong, having a deity who controlled the skies was a pretty good insurance policy. But Thor wasn't just about weather forecasts. He was the poster child for strength and bravery, qualities that chieftains wanted to project onto themselves and their warriors. When you're about to lead a raid across the North Sea, invoking the name of a god who could literally shatter mountains with his weapon was a way to boost morale and maybe, just maybe, intimidate your enemies a little. Now, let's not overlook the role of trade networks in all this. The Vikings weren't just raiders. They were traders who crisscrossed Europe, the Middle East, and even ventured as far as North America. These trade routes were the internet of their time, a web connecting diverse cultures and ideas. As Viking ships docked in ports from Constantinople to Baghdad, they didn't just offload goods like furs, amber, and ivory. They exchanged stories, ideas, and religious concepts. This cultural cross-pollination helped shape Norse mythology into a dynamic tapestry, where gods could adapt and evolve as needed, much like the Viking traders themselves. The impact of these trade networks on Norse mythology can't be overstated. Imagine a Viking merchant returning from a bustling Byzantine market with tales of foreign gods and exotic lands. These stories would be retold around the hearth, blending with local legends and adding new threads to the mythological fabric. This wasn't just idle chatter. It was a way to incorporate new ideas into the existing belief system, keeping it vibrant and relevant. Just as a savvy trader knows when to adapt to market demands, Norse mythology evolved to reflect the changing world of its storytellers. Furthermore, these myths served as a form of social cohesion. In a society where alliances were as fickle as the North Atlantic weather, having a shared set of beliefs helped unite disparate clans and tribes. By rallying around common gods and legends, communities could reinforce their cultural identity and strengthen their social bonds. It was like having a national anthem, minus the lyrics and the orchestra, but with a lot more dramatic flair. Now, let's address the elephant in the longhouse, the notion that these myths were purely the product of an imaginative and superstitious people. While it's easy to get caught up in the romance of a world filled with gods and giants, the reality is that these stories were deeply intertwined with the socio-political landscape. They were tools of propaganda, used to legitimize authority and inspire loyalty. A chieftain invoking Odin's wisdom wasn't just paying lip service to tradition. He was aligning himself with a powerful archetype that commanded respect and obedience. It's fascinating how these narratives could be tailored to suit the needs of the moment. Need to rally your warriors for a dangerous raid. Spin a tale of Thor's heroic exploits. Want to emphasize the importance of cunning and strategy. Regale the crowd with stories of Loki's trickery. Norse mythology was as flexible as a seasoned bard's repertoire, ready to adapt to the whims of its audience. And let's not forget the role of the skalds, the Viking poets who were the custodians of these myths. These wordsmiths were the rock stars of their time, traveling from court to court, entertaining and educating with their epic sagas. They were the historians, the journalists, and the entertainers rolled into one, preserving the collective memory of their people while ensuring that the stories remained relevant. A good skald could elevate a chieftain's status with a well-crafted verse, turning a minor victory into a legendary conquest. Talk about having the power of the pen, or the quill, in this case. As we continue to explore the evolution of Norse mythology, it's clear that these stories were much more than fantastical tales of gods and monsters. They were a reflection of the society that created them, a mirror held up to the complex web of politics, trade, and culture that defined the Viking Age. In a world where alliances shifted as often as the tides, and survival depended on both strength and cunning, mythology was a vital tool in the Viking arsenal, a way to navigate the chaos and uncertainty of life in the north. So, the next time you hear the thunderous rumble of a summer storm, remember that it's not just the sound of Thor's chariot racing across the sky. It's the echo of a 1,000-year-old narrative, crafted by chieftains and skalds, traders and warriors, each adding their own verse to the enduring saga of Norse mythology. As we look to the next part of our journey, we'll delve deeper into how these myths continue to evolve, shaped by the tides of history and the ever-changing world of their creators. Stay tuned. There's there's a lot more to explore in the saga of the Norse gods and their moral storytellers. As we delve further into the saga of Norse mythology, the plot thickens with an unexpected twist, the Christianization of Scandinavia. Now, this wasn't a simple case of Vikings swapping Thor's hammer for a crucifix like an easy trade-up at a medieval yard sale. Oh no, this was a cultural clash of epic proportions, akin to mixing oil with water, or in this case, mead with holy wine. Picture Scandinavia around the 10th century. The pagan Norse myths had been riding high on the narrative waves, but then along came Christianity, ready to shake things up. Missionaries started arriving like door-to-door salesmen, offering eternal salvation instead of vacuum cleaners. By the 11th century, the conversion was in full swing, with rulers like King Olaf Tryggvason and King Olaf Roman II of Norway pushing the gospel harder than a Black Friday sale. It was a strategic move. Aligning with Christian Europe offered political alliances and trade advantages that a mere mortal couldn't ignore. Now, let's talk numbers. By the end of the 11th century, Christianity was the dominant faith in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. This wasn't just a spiritual shift, it was an economic and political power play. Christianity brought with it a whole new set of alliances. Forget about raiding monasteries. Now you could trade with them. And let's be honest, the promise of eternal life was a pretty sweet deal, even for a Viking chieftain. But what happened to those beloved Norse tales under this new religious regime? Did they vanish like Loki in a puff of smoke? Not quite. Instead, they underwent a metamorphosis, adapting to survive in the Christian-dominated landscape. The myths didn't disappear. They were repurposed, reshaped, and sometimes even co-opted by the very faith that sought to replace them. Take Odin, for example. The one-eyed god of wisdom didn't just retreat into obscurity, he was reimagined. Remember Odin's infamous eye for wisdom trade-off. He sacrificed his eye at Mimir's well to gain knowledge, a story that echoes the Christian narrative of sacrifice for a higher purpose. The tale resonated with the Christian value placed on wisdom and learning. In a world where the church was the gatekeeper of knowledge, libraries were often within monastery walls. Odin's sacrifice became a parallel to the Christian pursuit of understanding, albeit with a more mythological flair. And speaking of Odin, let's not forget the economic context of knowledge in the medieval period. Books were luxury items, often costing as much as a small farm. The ability to read and write was a ticket to power, much like Odin's wisdom gave him an edge in the cosmic chess game of the gods. You see, the Norse myths weren't just stories. They were a currency of cultural capital, trading in ideas as much as goods. The Christian influence on these myths didn't stop with Odin. Thor, the hammer-wielding god of thunder, found echoes in the figure of Saint Olaf, a warrior king turned saint who held a similar appeal as a protector and divine enforcer. The myths were not erased, but instead found new forms, akin to a classic rock song being covered by a contemporary band. Different sound, same core message. Now, let's address the elephant in the medieval chapel. The idea that Christianization was a clean sweep of pagan traditions. The reality was far messier. While kings might have converted for political gain, the everyday Norse folks held onto their gods like a favorite pair of worn boots. Archaeological evidence shows that pagan practices continued well into the 12th century, with Christian and Norse symbols often found side by side in burial sites. It was like a theological mashup, where one didn't necessarily cancel out the other. In this period of transition, Norse mythology became a tool for both resistance and adaptation. It was a way to hold onto cultural identity while navigating the shifting sands of religious and political change. The myths evolved, much like the Vikings themselves, who adapted from raiders to traders to farmers, each time reinventing their identity without losing the essence of who they were. And let's not forget the role of the medieval skalds, those poetic custodians of myth who now had to navigate a world where their pagan tales could be seen as heretical. These wordsmiths were the original spin doctors, reworking stories to fit the Christian narrative without losing their mythological mojo. It was a delicate balancing act, much like walking a tightrope over a pit of rabid wolves. Except the wolves were bishops, and they had a thing for burning heretics at the stake. As Norse mythology continued to evolve, it became a mirror reflecting the complex interplay of faith and power, tradition, and change. The myths that survived did so because they could adapt, much like the people who told them. They were reshaped by the forces of history, yet they retained their core essence, offering insight into a world caught between two faiths, two ways of life. So, as we continue this journey through the Norse mythological landscape, remember that these stories are more than just ancient tales of gods and monsters. They are the echoes of a bygone era, where the clash of religions and cultures forged new narratives from the old. And as we venture further into the Christianized world of medieval Scandinavia, we'll see how these myths continue to influence the society they left behind, shaping the very fabric of the world they once explained. Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. The gods still have much to say, and so do we. As centuries ticked by like a clock in Valhalla, Norse mythology found itself in the peculiar position of being both a relic and a rebirth. Fast forward to the 19th century, and these old gods were dusted off and dressed up for a whole new audience. Enter the Romantic era, where the Victorians, with their penchant for dramatic flair and a love affair with the past, resurrected these myths with a zeal that would make a necromancer blush. Let's set the scene. Europe was awash with nationalist fervor, with countries yearning for unique identities that harkened back to a glorious, often mythical past. The Norse myths were ripe for the picking, offering a treasure trove of epic tales and heroic figures. It was as if the gods themselves were whispering, "Hey, remember us," into the ears of poets and scholars. The Victorians, always fans of a good story, embraced Norse mythology with open arms, and perhaps a monocle or two. They saw in these myths a romantic vision of a time when men were men, women were shield maidens, and gods casually strolled the earth. It was a narrative that appealed to the burgeoning sense of national pride, where the past was not just a foreign land, but a wild, untamed wilderness of potential. But let's not fool ourselves into thinking this was a purely altruistic endeavor. This revival had its pragmatic side. By the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, churning out steam engines and societal upheaval in equal measure. Amidst the smog and soot, people longed for a connection to something raw and real, a past not marred by the relentless march of progress. Norse mythology offered an escape, a way to reconnect with a world before the whir of the factory drowned out the crash of the ocean. Hugh Richard Wagner, the master composer and cultural alchemist, who would craft an operatic vision of Norse myth that was as grandiose as it was influential. Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen was a tetralogy that combined Norse and Germanic myths into a sprawling epic. Imagine if Tolkien had decided to write a rock opera, but with more Valkyries and less hobbits. Wagner's operas were a sensation, a theatrical tour de force that captured the imagination of a post-Napoleonic Europe hungry for identity. His works were drenched in the melodrama and mystique of Norse lore, with gods and heroes battling it out on a stage as grand as the myths themselves. Thor, the hammer-wielding god, got a makeover that would make even Marvel's casting directors envious. Instead of a god who just threw thunderbolts, Wagner gave us a complex deity with a Wagnerian flair for tragic grandeur and operatic angst. Yet, here's where things get interesting. Wagner's portrayal of Norse mythology wasn't just a revival, it was a reinvention. He took liberties with the source material, weaving in themes of power, betrayal, and redemption that resonated with the political and social undercurrents of his time. His operas were less about historical accuracy and more about capturing the human condition in all its flawed glory. Wagner wasn't just retelling old tales. He was crafting a new narrative that spoke to the soul of a Europe on the brink of modernity. And let's not ignore the economic engine behind this cultural renaissance. Opera houses were the entertainment hubs of the day, drawing in crowds like bees to honey or critics to an opening night. Wagner's productions were lavish affairs, employing scores of musicians, singers, and stager hands. The cost of staging such operas was astronomical, rivaling the GDP of a small nation-state. But for audiences, it was worth every penny, offering a front-row seat to the drama and spectacle of a bygone age, with the added bonus of a stirring soundtrack. Nationalist movements across Europe latched onto Norse mythology like a lifeline, using it to stoke the fires of identity and pride. In Germany, for instance, these myths were seen as part of a shared Teutonic heritage, a cultural touchstone that helped to unify disparate states into a cohesive nation. The idea was simple. If you wanted to forge a nation, why not start with a shared foundation of gods and heroes? But let's not romanticize it too much. While Wagner and his contemporaries were spinning tales of gods and glory, the reality was that these myths were being used as tools of political and cultural manipulation. They were repurposed to serve the needs of the present, much like a well-worn story adapted for a new audience. The appeal of Norse mythology lay not just in the past it evoked, but in the future it promised, a future where national identity was as strong as Thor's hammer and as enduring as Odin's wisdom. As we delve deeper into this 19th century revival, it becomes clear that Norse mythology was more than just a collection of ancient stories. It was a cultural phenomenon, a bridge between the past and the present that allowed people to navigate the tumultuous seas of change. And as the Victorians embraced these myths, they not only reshaped them, but also imbued them with new meaning, creating a legacy that endures to this day. So, as we prepare to journey further into the world of Norse mythology, remember that these stories are not just relics of a distant past. They are living, breathing entities that have evolved over time, shaped by the hands of those who told them. Whether through the operatic genius of Wagner or the nationalist fervor of a burgeoning Europe, these myths continue to captivate and inspire, offering a window into the soul of a people and a past we are still striving to understand. Stay with us as we explore the next chapter in this saga, where the echoes of Norse mythology continue to reverberate through the corridors of time. The 19th century revival of Norse mythology was just the opening act for the saga that would unfold in the 20th and 21st centuries, a saga that would see these ancient tales leap from the pages of dusty tomes to the screens of multiplexes worldwide. The gods of Asgard, once confined to the imaginations of medieval skalds and Victorian poets, found themselves cast in a new role, pop culture icons. And who better to lead this charge than the trickster god himself, Loki? In a world where reinvention is the name of the game, Loki's knack for adaptation has turned him from a mythical mischief maker into a muse for modern storytellers. It's no surprise that Norse mythology found fertile ground in the world of comic books. After all, both are built on larger-than-life heroes, epic battles, and moral quandaries that make for page-turning drama. Enter Marvel Comics, the powerhouse that in 1962 introduced audiences to Thor, Loki, and the rest of the Asgardian crew. Created by writer Stan Lee and artist Jack Kirby, Thor's debut in * Journey into Mystery * 83 was a thunderous success, literally. This wasn't just a comic book. It was a cultural phenomenon that would reverberate across decades. Marvel's Thor wasn't the brooding deity of Wagnerian opera, nor the solemn figure of ancient myth. Nope, he was a clean-cut superhero with a penchant for justice, wielding his hammer Mjolnir like a Norse Captain America. The comic series took liberties with the source material, of course, but that was part of its charm. It captured the essence of Norse myth while giving it a modern twist, much like adding a splash of soda to a stiff drink. And it worked. By the 1970s, Thor was a staple of the Marvel universe, battling everything from cosmic entities to his own family drama. Now, let's talk numbers. By the 1980s, Marvel Comics was selling around 13 million issues annually, a testament to the enduring appeal of their myth-infused superheroes. But here's the kicker. The price of a comic book back in 1962 was just 12 cents. Fast forward to today, and those early issues can fetch thousands of dollars at auction. It seems the Thunder God not only weathered the storm of changing tastes, but rode it to the bank. The evolution from comic book pages to blockbuster screens was inevitable. Enter the Marvel Cinematic Universe, MCU, which took Norse mythology to new heights with films that were both critically acclaimed and box office gold mines. Thor debuted on the silver screen in 2011, portrayed by the chiseled Chris Hemsworth, a casting choice that seemed to suggest the gods themselves had a hand in Hollywood's decisions. The film raked in $449 million worldwide, proving that audiences couldn't get enough of their favorite Norse god punching his way through cosmic conflicts. Then there's Loki, the trickster god who stole the show with his charisma and complexity. Played by Tom Hiddleston, Loki became the villain we all love to hate, or perhaps just love, period. The character's development from a power-hungry antagonist to a multifaceted antihero reflected our own fascination with the grey areas of morality. Loki's popularity was such that he even got his own Disney Plus series, a testament to his enduring appeal and the power of a well-told tale. But it's not just about dollars and cents. It's about cultural influence. The MCU films have reached billions of viewers worldwide, bringing Norse mythology to a global audience and sparking renewed interest in the original tales. Suddenly, everyone from schoolchildren to scholars was talking about Ragnarok, Yggdrasil, and the Nine Realms. The myths had become a shared language, a cultural touchstone that connected people across continents. And let's not kid ourselves. This modern resurgence isn't purely about mythological accuracy. The movies and comics take creative liberties, blending myth with modern sensibilities, much like a cook spicing up an old family recipe. The result is a product that resonates with contemporary audiences, offering both escapism and a lens through which to examine the human condition. After all, who doesn't love a story where the stakes are cosmic and the characters are gods? Yet, there's a deeper layer to this resurgence, one that speaks to our own search for identity and meaning in an increasingly chaotic world. Just as the Victorians turned to Norse myths for a sense of connection to the past, we turn to these stories to navigate our own complex realities. They offer a narrative framework, a way to explore themes of power, responsibility, and the eternal struggle between good and evil. In a world where the lines between right and wrong are as blurred as a watercolor painting left in the rain, these myths provide clarity and comfort. But let's peel back the curtain and examine the economics of this mythological boom. The MCU has grossed over $29 billion as of 2023, making it the highest-grossing film franchise of all time. That's more money than the GDP of some small countries. It seems the allure of gods and heroes isn't just timeless, it's wildly profitable. Studios have tapped into a gold mine of storytelling potential, proving that even ancient myths can yield modern riches. The global reach of Norse mythology in pop culture is a testament to its adaptability. It transcends borders, appealing to diverse audiences who find in these tales a reflection of their own hopes, fears, and aspirations. It's a reminder that at the heart of every myth is a kernel of truth about the human experience, a truth that resonates regardless of time or place. As we wrap up this journey through the evolution of Norse mythology, it's clear that these stories are more than just relics of a distant past. They are living narratives, continually reshaped by the hands of those who tell them. From the fjords of ancient Scandinavia to the neon-lit screens of modern cinemas, the myths have endured, offering wisdom and wonder to each new generation. And so, as the credits roll on this chapter of Norse mythology, remember that the gods aren't just ancient figures etched in stone. They are vibrant characters living in our imaginations, inspiring us to dream, to question, and to create. Whether through the pages of a comic book, the frames of a film, or the verses of an opera, these myths continue to captivate and challenge us, inviting us to explore the stories we tell about ourselves and the world around us. In the end, perhaps that's the true power of Norse mythology, its ability to evolve, to inspire, and to endure. Much like Loki, these tales have a knack for reinvention, forever finding new ways to capture the hearts and minds of those who listen. And in a world where change is the only constant, that's a legacy worth celebrating. So, here's to the gods of Asgard. May their stories continue to echo through the ages, reminding us of the power of myth to shape and illuminate our lives. Before the sun even thinks about making an appearance, you're up and at M in a 19th century coal mining town, where the day kicks off with a jarring whistle rather than a gentle nudge from a smartphone alarm. If you're dreaming about hitting the snooze button, think again. The only thing hitting you this morning is the cold reality of a miner's life. Welcome to your new life, where breakfast is as bleak as the scenery. Forget avocado toast. You're lucky if you get a slice of stale bread and a dollop of lard. Maybe a cup of weak tea if you're feeling fancy. At this point, you might be wondering how anyone stomached this daily grind. The secret: they didn't have much of a choice. With wages scraping the bottom of the barrel at around $0, $50 a day, barely enough to keep a family from starvation, everyone, and I mean everyone, had to pull their weight. Even the kids, as young as 6, were headed underground. School, that's a luxury for someone else's kids. Now, let's talk about your commute. No carpool lanes or public transport here. Just a treacherous, muddy trek to the mine, where every step is a reminder of the drudgery ahead. Maybe you're stepping over puddles or trying to avoid the sludge, but there's no escaping the feeling that you're walking into the jaws of a beast. The mine looms ahead like a gaping mouth, ready to swallow you whole. But why the heck would anyone voluntarily dive into this pit of despair? Well, for starters, the Industrial Revolution wasn't going to power itself. Coal was the miracle fuel of the age, feeding the insatiable engines of progress from steam trains to factory furnaces. And in a world with precious few social safety nets, a job in the mines, however perilous, meant survival for many families. The economic pressures were immense, a relentless force pushing entire communities underground. Let's not sugarcoat it. The conditions were brutal. Safety standards were more like suggestions, and accidents were as common as the morning chill. You'd hear stories of cave-ins and gas explosions whispered in hushed tones over your meager breakfast. The threat was real, and so was the fear. Yet, each morning, you'd lace up your boots and head out, because what choice did you have? It was either that or face the harsh reality of unemployment and ultimately destitution. The romantic narrative of the rugged miner, bravely facing nature's raw power, makes for a compelling story, but strip away the legend, and you're left with the stark reality. A life of grueling labor, economic necessity, and survival. It's far from the gallant adventure, sometimes painted in nostalgic tales. Picture the scene painted by the words of George Orwell, who described the miner's plight in The Road to Wigan Pier. The cramped conditions, the omnipresent dust, the sense of impending doom. It's no wonder that by the time your shift begins, you're already bone-weary. Yet the camaraderie among miners was legendary. They had to trust each other with their lives, after all. This bond was forged in the fires of shared hardship, a silver lining in an otherwise grim existence. As you near the mine's entrance, the weight of the world seems to settle on your shoulders, quite literally, as you prepare to descend into the darkness. But before you go, take a moment to look around. You're not alone. Your fellow miners, faces lined with coal, dust, and determination, are your companions on this daily odyssey. They're not just co-workers, they're your lifeline. Economic pressures were the great equalizer, driving entire families into the depths. In many mining towns, it wasn't uncommon for fathers and sons, or even daughters, to work side by side. The family unit was both a source of strength and a stark reminder of the sacrifices required to keep food on the table. So, take a deep breath, savor the cold morning air, because soon enough you'll be trading it for the stale, suffocating atmosphere of the mine. It's a tough life, no doubt. But within this world of soot and shadows, there's a resilience, a tenacity that's hard to ignore. As you prepare to enter the mine, you can't help but feel a grudging respect for those who have made this journey day after day, year after year. They were the backbone of an era, the unsung heroes of the industrial age. And now, for this day, you walk in their shoes. As you step into the mine, the first thing that hits you is the darkness. It's not just any darkness. It's an all-consuming, enveloping black that swallows everything. Forget the gentle dimming of a bedroom light. This is the kind of pitch black that makes you question the existence of sunlight altogether. With every step deeper into the mine, you're leaving behind the world you know and entering a realm where time seems to stop and space is a tight, crushing embrace. The air is thick and dank, an invisible enemy sapping your strength with every breath. Ventilation, if you can call it that, is more of a rumor than a reality. It's a miracle if you make it to the end of your shift without feeling lightheaded or worse. And let's not forget the ever-present threat of gas, carbon monoxide, methane, all waiting to catch you off guard. The Davy lamp, a trusty companion in these treacherous conditions, was invented in 1815 by Humphrey Davy. It was designed to prevent explosions by encasing the flame within a fine mesh, a brilliant solution that was only marginally reassuring when you knew the mine was ready to turn on you at any moment. Speaking of reassurance, safety standards in the 19th century were more like polite suggestions. The only thing standing between you and a cave-in was, well, luck, and perhaps the occasional sturdy beam. With collapses and explosions as common as dirt under your fingernails, it's a wonder anyone got anything done. In the United Kingdom alone, the Mines Regulation Act of 1872 was one of the first steps toward imposing some semblance of safety. But even then, enforcement was patchy at best. You'd be forgiven for thinking you were part of some grim lardery, where only the prize was survival. As you navigate the cramped, twisting tunnels, it becomes clear that personal space is a concept best left at the mine entrance. Miners often worked in seams as low as 18 inches high, which meant a lot of crawling or lying on your side while hacking at coal with a pickaxe. If you've ever complained about your office chair or the strain of sitting too long, just imagine you're back after a 12-hour shift in a contorted position, with only the sound of picks striking rock to keep you company. The tools of the trade were as unforgiving as the mine itself. The pickaxe, a simple yet brutal instrument, was your best friend and worst enemy. With each swing, you chipped away at the coal face, praying you wouldn't encounter a pocket of gas or an unstable section of rock. Sure, there was a certain rhythm to it, a back and forth that might seem meditative if it weren't for the knowledge that any misstep could be your last. And then there's the coal. It's everywhere, in your hair, under your nails, in your lungs. Black lung, or coal workers' pneumoconiosis, was the not-so-friendly reminder that even if you survived the immediate dangers, the job was still killing you slowly from the inside. In the late 1800, the lack of understanding around occupational health meant that miners often worked until they physically couldn't anymore, their bodies betraying them long before any pension could be claimed. Despite the gloom, there's a strange sort of camaraderie in the pit. The miner next to you isn't just a co-worker, he's a brother in arms, someone who understands the unspoken fears and the small triumphs that come with each day survived. It's this shared experience that forges bonds stronger than any family reunion. In a world where life is cheap and danger is a constant companion, trust becomes the most valuable currency. Now, if you're wondering why anyone would put themselves through this day after day, the answer is as simple as it is heartbreaking. Necessity. The Industrial Revolution was an insatiable beast, and coal was its lifeblood. The demand was insurmountable, and so was the pressure on those who dug it out of the earth. For many, it was the only option, a way to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. And let's not forget the allure of the miner's wage, modest as it was. In Britain, a miner could hope to make around £2 a week by the mid-1800s, a sum that seemed substantial compared to other labourers, despite the inherent risks. Yet this was barely enough to scrape by, especially with the spectre of unemployment looming over every mining town. Talk about a rock and a hard place. Every now and then, you might catch a glimpse of the romantic notion of the miner as a rugged individualist, a lone hero battling the elements. But those sepia-toned images are more myth than reality. The truth is far grittier and less glamorous, a tale of survival and sacrifice that gets lost amidst the tales of industrial glory and progress. So, here you are, deep in the belly of the beast, wielding your pickaxe with a determination born out of necessity rather than choice. Each swing is a defiance of the odds stacked against you, and as you chip away at the coal face, you can't help but think of all those who have come before you, who have faced the same darkness and emerged, if not unscathed, at least still breathing. There's a certain poetry in it, a rhythm that speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. The mine might be a harsh mistress, but it's a testament to the strength and tenacity of those who toiled within its depths. They weren't just cogs in the industrial machine. They were the unsung architects of progress, the backbone of an era that reshaped the world. And as you stand there, surrounded by shadows and soot, you realize that, like them, you're part of a story much larger than yourself. So take a moment, catch your breath, and prepare to dig deeper. Because down here in the dark, the day is far from over, and the coal face waits for no one. Deep in the bowels of the earth, the coal face waits, unrelenting and uncaring. You swing your pickaxe, each strike a battle cry in the war against the rock. The rhythm of hard metal on stone is almost hypnotic, a reminder that here in the depths, time ticks to a different beat. But just when you think you've settled into the grim dance, a different kind of rhythm emerges, the scuttling of tiny feet. Welcome to the rat race, 19th century style. Rats in the mines were as common as coal dust, and if you're squeamish, well, you might want to look away now. These furry squatters were both bane and boon. On the one hand, they were about as welcome as a gas leak. On the other, they served as an early warning system. You see, rats have a knack for sensing danger long before humans do. If you ever see a rat bolting for the exit, you best follow suit, because it's probably sniffed out something you haven't, like a pocket of deadly gas or an impending collapse. Speaking of gas, let's talk about the invisible enemies lurking in the shadows. Methane and carbon monoxide were miners' worst nightmares. Imagine working in an environment where the air itself could betray you at any moment. The Davy lamp, with its protective mesh, was your first line of defense, but it was hardly foolproof. One wrong move, one careless spark, and you'd find yourself in the middle of a fireworks display you definitely didn't sign up for. In a particularly harrowing example, the Hartley Colliery disaster of 1862 claimed 204 lives when a beam collapsed, trapping the miners and cutting off ventilation. No amount of gallows humor can mask the chilling truth that a miner's life was always hanging by a thread. Yet, amidst the gloom and peril, a peculiar social ecosystem thrived. Down here, social dynamics were as layered as the coal seams themselves. It's easy to romanticize the camaraderie among miners, and to be fair, the bond was real, born out of necessity and shared hardship. But what's less often talked about is the brutal hierarchy that existed underground. Age and experience commanded respect, and the youngest workers, often children, were at the bottom of the pecking order. Yes, you heard that right. Children as young as 6 or 7 were regulars in the mines, their small frames making them ideal for wriggling through narrow seams. Known as trappers, they had the unenviable job of opening and closing ventilation doors, spending long hours in stifling darkness with only a candle for company. Child labor wasn't just a sad reality. It was an economic necessity for families struggling to survive. In the 1842 Children's Employment Commission report, it was revealed that in some regions, children made up nearly a third of the mining workforce. The romantic image of the miner as a rugged adult hero conveniently glosses over this grim aspect of the mining world. As for those who owned the mines, well, they were playing a different game altogether. Mine owners were the industrial titans of their day, more concerned with profit margins than human lives. The insatiable demand for coal during the Industrial Revolution meant that operations had to run like clockwork, and any downtime was a direct hit to the bottom line. Safety measures, when they existed, were often seen as costly interruptions rather than essential protections. The Mines Regulation Act of 1872 was a step toward change, but enforcement was spotty, and many owners found loopholes to skirt around the rules. For them, the equation was brutally simple. More coal meant more money. And in a market where coal was king, the human cost was a price they were willing to pay. To the mine owners, workers were replaceable cogs in a vast industrial machine, and the harsh realities of life underground were just part of the operational hazards. Of course, this cold calculation didn't sit well with the miners, who were acutely aware of the disparity between their lives and the luxuries enjoyed by those who controlled the mines. The tension between labor and capital simmered like a pot about to boil over, setting the stage for future labor movements and demands for better working conditions. Back in the tunnels, the air is thick with more than just dust. There's an unspoken understanding among the men that they're part of something larger, a shared struggle against forces both natural and man-made. It's a world where trust is the most valuable currency, and everyone knows that their survival depends on the man working beside them. This camaraderie is a double-edged sword, providing comfort, but also highlighting the precariousness of their existence. As the hours drag on, fatigue sets in. Your muscles ache, your lungs burn, and every breath feels like a betrayal. But there's no time for rest. The coal won't dig itself, and the day isn't over until the whistle blows. It's a relentless grind, a test of endurance that reminds you just how fragile human life can be in the face of industrial ambition. The romantic notion of the noble miner risking life and limb for progress is a narrative that's easy to sell, but the reality is far more complex and infinitely grittier. These men and children were the backbone of an era unsung heroes whose sacrifices fueled the engines of change. Yet their stories often fade into the background, overshadowed by the gleaming achievements of the age they helped build. So, as you chip away at the coal face, consider the legacy of those who toiled in these dark, dangerous places. They were not just victims of circumstance, but active participants in the relentless march of progress. Their resilience and tenacity are a testament to human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's a flicker of light, a spark of hope that refuses to be extinguished. As your shift finally draws to a close, and you begin the long, weary ascent back to the surface, take a moment to reflect on the journey. You've walked in the footsteps of giants, felt the weight of history on your shoulders, and glimpsed the harsh realities that shaped a world. And while the day may have ended, the story is far from over. There are more tales waiting to be told, more shadows to illuminate, and more myths to unravel as you continue to explore the depths of history. As you finally step out from the oppressive belly of the mine, the late afternoon sun greets you like an old friend you haven't seen in years. It's a stark reminder that life exists beyond the shadows, even if it's just for a few precious hours. The air is fresher up here, but don't get too comfortable. The challenges of home life in a 19th century mining town are waiting just around the corner, ready to remind you that the day's trials are far from over. First, let's talk accommodations. Forget any notions of cozy cottages with white picket fences. We're talking about cramped, creaky houses that seem to sag under the weight of their own existence. Built by the mining companies, these homes were as bare bones as it gets. The company-owned town was the 19th century equivalent of a dystopian HOA nightmare. Imagine paying rent to your boss and having zero say in maintenance. Spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. The average miner's home was a two-room affair, with the kitchen pulling double duty as a living room, dining room, and catch-all space for whatever life threw your way. Privacy was a joke, and personal space, about as real as unicorns. Yet these modest quarters were filled to the brim with families, sometimes 10 to a household, and with an average weekly rent of around £2, you might as well have been paying for a lavish mansion, given how much it ate into your miner's paycheck. Let's not forget about heating, essential for those bone-chilling winter months. You'd think being surrounded by coal would solve that problem, but the reality was, coal was a luxury even for those who mined it. Families often had to budget their coal usage to avoid burning through their supplies too quickly, turning their homes into iceboxes by choice. It's a cruel irony, like a baker who can't afford bread. As for the amenities, piped water and indoor plumbing were the stuff of fairy tales. Water was fetched from communal pumps, a chore that added to the daily grind. And if you're picturing a quaint, neighborly gathering around the water pump, think again. It was just another line to stand in, another reminder of the scarcity that defined everyday life. And then there was food. With wages barely scraping by, every meal was an exercise in creative survival. Meat was a rare treat, reserved for special occasions or Sundays, if you were lucky. The daily fare consisted of potatoes, bread, and whatever vegetables were in season. Nutritional variety wasn't just limited, it was practically non-existent. It's no wonder that malnutrition was rampant, with families doing their best to stretch every penny. Speaking of pennies, let's talk debt. The ever-present shadow looming over every miner's household. With wages as unpredictable as the weather, many miners found themselves caught in a cycle of debt that was as suffocating as the coal dust they inhaled daily. The company store, that bastion of capitalist manipulation, was both a blessing and a curse. Yes, it offered credit, but the prices were marked up to the point where you'd need a magnifying glass to find your savings. It was a classic case of robbing Peter to pay Paul, with the company always coming out on top. But amidst the gloom, there were glimmers of light, community support systems that offered a lifeline in hard times. The church, for instance, wasn't just a place of worship. It was a hub of social interaction and mutual aid. It was where miners and their families gathered for solace, support, and the occasional charity handout. The Sunday service was as much about spiritual nourishment as it was about catching up on the latest news and gossip. Then there were the co-ops, those early experiments in collective bargaining and mutual aid. While not as widespread as one might hope, these organizations were a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of miners seeking to improve their lot. By pooling resources and buying in bulk, miners could bypass the company store's exorbitant prices. It was a small rebellion against the system, but a rebellion nonetheless. Social norms also played a role in softening the edges of this harsh existence. Hospitality and neighborliness were more than just pleasantries. They were survival strategies. Families often relied on each other for childcare, meal sharing, and emotional support. In a world where the margin between subsistence and starvation was razor-thin, Community barns were the glue that held everything together. This communal spirit was especially evident during times of crisis. The death of a miner was a blow felt not just by the immediate family, but by the entire community. Funerals, while sama, were collective affairs, with everyone chipping in to help cover the costs. It was an unwritten rule, a social contract that ensured no one faced the darkness alone. And let's not overlook the role of women, the unsung heroes who kept the wheels turning while the men were underground. Their labor was as essential as it was invisible, from managing the household to taking on work outside the home when ends didn't meet. They were the backbone of the community, the quiet architects of resilience and survival. As evening approaches and the town settles into its nightly routine, there's a palpable sense of weary acceptance. The day may have ended, but the challenges remain, a constant companion in the lives of those who call this place home. Yet, even in the face of adversity, there's a stubborn tenacity that refuses to be extinguished, a collective determination to push through another day. So as you sit down to your modest supper, surrounded by family and the comforting hum of shared stories, take a moment to appreciate the strength and spirit of those who lived this life. They were more than just footnotes in history. They were the heartbeat of an era, the living testament to the power of human endurance. And while the romantic image of the noble miner might gloss over the harsh realities, it's in these details, the grit, the struggle, the unwavering spirit, that the true story unfolds. As you prepare to face another day, remember that you're part of a legacy that's as rich and complex as the coal seams themselves, a story that continues to unfold with each passing chapter. As the last crumbs of your humble supper disappear, the weight of the day settles in, uninvited, like a guest who overstays their welcome. The aches in your muscles tell tales of labor far beyond your years, and your skin, perfumed by the persistent scent of coal, feels as if it's become one with the dust. It's in these quiet moments of reflection that the true cost of mining reveals itself, not just in physical exhaustion, but in the emotional toll it exacts. The life of a 19th century miner was a relentless cycle of toil and survival, dictated not by the clerk, but by the demands of coal and the whims of those who owned it. While the rest of the world marveled at steam engines and steel bridges, few paused to consider the human collateral that fueled such progress. Industrial revolution, for all its marvels, was built on the backs of miners who rarely saw more than a flicker of its benefits. Now let's talk about the economy, because while your personal finances might be struggling to stay afloat, the broader picture is one of skyrocketing demand. Coal wasn't just a commodity, it was the beating heart of the industrial economy. In 1850, Britain alone consumed around 50 million tons of coal annually. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the weight of 50 million elephants, and it's all thanks to miners like you who chipped away at the earth, day in and day out. This demand wasn't just about keeping the industrial wheels turning, it was about global dominance. The coal-paved path led to Britain's emergence as a world leader, boasting an empire where the sun never set. Yet, for the folks below ground, the promise of imperial glory translated into little more than a slightly heavier pocket change, barely enough to keep their own household fires lit. The harsh irony of it all is that while mining communities powered the nation, they themselves were often left powerless. The lever of control was firmly in the hands of mine owners who saw workers as expendable resources. This imbalance didn't go unnoticed, and the seeds of discontent were sown deep in the coal seams. The fight for workers' rights, which would come to define the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was ignited by the injustice faced by miners. Enter the labor movement, a beacon of hope in the shadow of exploitation. The formation of trade unions became a rallying cry for improved conditions, fair wages, and a voice that could not be ignored. The Miners' Federation of Great Britain, established in 1888, was one such voice, growing to represent over 600,000 members by 1908. It was a force to be reckoned with, a testament to the power of collective action in the face of adversity. But let's not get too carried away with the notion of noble rebellion. The path to labor rights was neither swift nor smooth. It was a battle fought in boardrooms, picket lines, and sometimes even in the courts. Progress was often met with fierce resistance from those who stood to lose the most, the mine owners who preferred to keep the status quo firmly entrenched in their favor. Yet, through these struggles, emerged breakthroughs that laid the groundwork for modern labor rights. The 8 Hours Act of 1908, which limited miners' shifts to a more humane duration, was one such victory. It was a hard-won concession that signaled a shift in societal attitudes, a recognition that workers deserved not just to survive, but to live with dignity. So, as you settle into bed, the weight of history presses down like the leaden sky before a storm. The romanticized image of the industrious miner, forever chiseled in sepia tones, falls apart under the scrutiny of reality. These were not just tireless heroes of industry, but human beings with dreams, fears, and a fierce determination to carve out a better life for themselves and their communities. And what of the legacy left behind? It's a tapestry woven with threads of resilience, sacrifice, and an unyielding spirit. The miners of the 19th century didn't just extract coal. They extracted change, digging deep into the bedrock of society to lay the foundations for future generations. Their struggles for better working conditions and fair treatment echo through time, a reminder that progress is often forged in the crucible of hardship. As you drift into sleep, think of the countless miners who came before, whose lives were a testament to the indomitable human spirit. They were the unsung architects of an era that reshaped the world, their legacy etched not in stone, but in the very air we breathe. And while their stories may have been buried beneath the glittering veneer of industrial achievement, they remain, waiting to be unearthed and remembered. So, here's to the miners, to their grit, their courage, and their unwavering hope for a brighter tomorrow. As you close your eyes, let the lessons of their lives guide you, a beacon in the darkness, illuminating the path toward a more just and equitable world. Because in the end, their story is our story, a tale of resilience and redemption, of struggle and triumph, a legacy that continues to inspire us all. In the bustling tapestry of 19th century Korea, where the Joseon dynasty was hanging on by a thread, a young woman named Myeongseong, later known as Empress Myeongseong, was about to turn the courtly world upside down. Born on October 19, 1851, her early years in the province of Yeoju might have seemed unremarkable, had it not been for her razor-sharp wit and a knack for playing the long game, even as a child. She wasn't just another girl from a Yangban family. She was the wild card who'd soon be dealing hands in the highest stakes game in the land. The Joseon dynasty, if you're wondering, was like a 500-year-old grandpa still trying to run marathons. By the time Myeongseong entered the scene, the dynasty was facing challenges left, right, and center. Internal strife, external pressures, and a royal court that was less Downton Abbey and more Game of Thrones. Picture a kingdom where every advice from courtiers was laced with ulterior motives and everyone had a dagger hidden in their sleeve. Into this delightful chaos, Min Yaong married King Garjong in 1866 when she was just 15. Now, let's not romanticize things too much. This was no Disney fairy tale. Myeongseong didn't just waltz into power. She stepped into a viper's nest of political intrigue. The king's father, Hyungsin Diwongun, was the de facto ruler with an iron fist and was about as fond of independent queens as a cat is of a bath. Her marriage was more political chess move than love story, and she knew it. Her rise to prominence didn't come from being a passive royal. Oh no, she was sharp as a tack and twice as shrewd. She navigated the court like a seasoned diplomat, understanding that power in the Joseon court was as much about perception as it was about control. She quickly learned who to trust, spoiler alert, almost no one, and how to leverage alliances. In a place where court ladies and eunuchs could wield more influence than ministers, Myeongseong played her cards close to her chest. One of the myths about her life is that she simply charmed her way to the top. Sure, she had charisma, but let's give her credit where it's due. She was a political mastermind. She understood the delicate balance of power and knew when to stir the pot and when to let things simmer. Her ability to read people and situations was almost eerily accurate. She had a knack for making friends with the right people at the right time, which, in the cutthroat world of Joseon politics, was a superpower. There's a particularly amusing anecdote from her early years at court that highlights her cleverness. Picture a grand banquet, the kind where alliances are forged over fermented cabbage and rice wine. Myeongseong, still new to the courtly scene, managed to turn an awkward seating arrangement into a brilliant political maneuver. By subtly influencing who sat where, She ensured that those with similar grievances against the Diwangan found themselves in close proximity, sparking discussions that would later blossom into full-blown opposition. It was like setting up a domino line, then casually walking away as they toppled in perfect sequence. And let's talk about the myths. Legend has it that she was a helpless damsel swept up by destiny. In reality, Myeongseong was more like a 19th century chess grandmaster in a handbag. Historical records, including letters and court documents, suggest she was anything but helpless. She had a keen understanding of geopolitics and was deeply involved in state affairs. Her influence extended far beyond the domestic sphere as she engaged with foreign powers, recognizing early on that Korea's survival depended on strategic international alliances. So why do these myths persist? Well, the romantic notion of a fragile young woman rising to power against all odds makes for a compelling story. It's the kind of narrative that sticks in the public imagination, like a catchy tune you can't shake. But the truth, as always, is more complex and infinitely more interesting. Myeongseong was a force of nature, a woman who understood the intricacies of power and wielded it with finesse and determination. As she settled into her role, Myeongseong began to build a network of loyalists who would support her vision for a modernized Korea. She saw the cracks in the old ways and was determined to reinforce the structure before it all came crumbling down. But of course, she had to do it all while dodging the metaphorical and sometimes literal daggers aimed her way. This was not a job for the faint-hearted, and Myeongseong was anything but. Her early years at court were a masterclass in strategic maneuvering. She wasn't just surviving, she was setting the stage for a reign that would challenge the status quo. In the end, Empress Myeongseong's story is not just one of ascent, but of resilience and strategic brilliance. She was a woman who knew her worth and wielded her influence with a keen understanding of the political landscape she navigated. And if that's not the hallmark of a true empress, I don't know what is. And so, with the stage set, and a cast of characters that would make House of Cards blush, Empress Myeongseong embarked on her quest to pull Korea back from the brink. The 19th century was a time when global powers were playing a high-stakes game of risk, and Korea was the board they were all eyeing. The Joseon dynasty was stuck between a rock and a hard place, with China on one side, Japan on the other, and Western powers circling like sharks smelling blood in the water. But Myeongseong wasn't about to let her country become a mere pawn. First order of business, get some allies who wouldn't sell you out faster than a limited edition sneaker drop. Myeongseong knew that Korea needed friends in high places, and she looked to the west with a discerning eye. She had her eye on the prize, and that prize was modernization. She recognized that Korea's best bet to maintain sovereignty was to embrace the technological advancements that were revolutionizing the world. No small feat for a dynasty that was, let's face it, a little behind on the times. It was as if they were still sending telegrams while everyone else was already on email. To kick things off, she turned her attention to education, pushing for the introduction of Western learning. Picture the Joseon court, where Confucian scholars clung to their scrolls like hipsters to vinyl records, suddenly faced with the concept of science and math beyond their wildest dreams. It was a culture shock of epic proportions, but Myeongseong was resolute. She understood that knowledge was power, and that Korea needed a new generation of leaders who could speak the language of diplomacy and technology. Now, let's talk about her diplomatic maneuvers. If you think modern politics is a soap opera, you haven't met Myeongseong. Her relationships with foreign powers were like a season of The Bachelor, where roses were replaced with treaties, and every suitor had an agenda. She cozied up to Russia, hoping they'd play the role of a protective big brother against Japan's increasing aggression. In 1896, she even facilitated the signing of a treaty with the Russian Empire, a strategic move that was akin to inviting the school bully to your birthday party just to keep things peaceful. But wait, there's more. Myeongseong's diplomacy wasn't limited to just Russia. She was like the ultimate networker at a diplomatic cocktail party, shaking hands with anyone who might advance Korea's interests. She engaged with the United States, although let's be honest, the Americans were more interested in expanding their own influence than playing knight in shining armor. Still, the fact that she managed to maintain a dialogue with multiple global powers speaks volumes about her skills as a stateswoman. She was playing a multi-layered game of chess, where each move had to be calculated to perfection. Of course, this didn't sit well with everyone. Her efforts to bring Korea into the modern age ruffled more than a few feathers. Traditionalists saw her as a threat, and her growing influence was a bitter pill for many to swallow. It's the classic tale of the new kid in school who wants to change the lunch menu while the old guard clings to their mystery meat and mashed potatoes. The opposition was fierce, but Myeongseong was not one to back down. She understood the stakes and was willing to endure the slings and arrows for the greater good. The modernization efforts extended beyond just education and diplomacy. Myeongseong was all about bringing Korea up to speed with infrastructure too. She advocated for the construction of railways and telegraph lines, which were the equivalent of installing 5G towers today. This was a time when getting a letter across the country could take longer than a season finale of your favorite show, so these advancements were revolutionary. The introduction of railways in particular symbolized a leap into the future, providing not just transportation, but a means to unify the nation. Her approach to modernization was as pragmatic as it was ambitious. She knew that to stand toe-to-toe with the global giants, Korea needed more than just fancy treaties and Western textbooks. It needed the practical tools of a modern state, and she was determined to provide them. Yet, her vision was not without its challenges. Resistance came not only from within, but also from neighboring powers who saw Korea's awakening as a threat to their own interests. And herein lies the myth-busting magic of Myeongseong's story. The romanticized notion of her as a lone heroine battling against the tide is compelling, but it glosses over the complex web of alliances, betrayals, and negotiations she navigated. She wasn't just fighting an uphill battle. She was rewriting the rules of the game as she went along. Her diplomatic finesse was as much about survival as it was about ambition, and she was nothing if not ambitious. So why does the myth persist? Because the idea of a solitary figure challenging the status quo and emerging victorious is irresistible. It's the kind of narrative that sells books and fills theaters. But the reality is that Myeongseong's reign was a testament to the power of strategic partnerships and a keen understanding of the geopolitical landscape. Her efforts were not just about preserving the past, but forging a future where Korea could stand its ground in a rapidly changing world. In the end, Empress Myeongseong's legacy is one of resilience, innovation, and unyielding determination. She was a woman ahead of her time, steering her nation through choppy waters with a steady hand and a clear vision. And while her story is far from over, this chapter in her life is a reminder that true power lies not just in holding the reins, but in knowing when to loosen them, when to forge alliances, and when to stand firm. Stay tuned, because the saga of Empress Myeongseong is just getting started, and the next act promises to be just as riveting. Now, just as Empress Myeongseong was getting into the groove of modernizing Korea, the Sino-Japanese War came along like an uninvited party crasher, throwing a wrench into her plans. You see, this wasn't just any war. It was the opening act of Japan's grand entrance onto the world stage, with Korea caught in the crossfire. The year was 1894, and while the rest of the world was busy inventing things like the radio and the zipper, East Asia was embroiled in a high-stakes showdown that would redraw the geopolitical map. The Sino-Japanese War was essentially a tug-of-war over Korea between King China and Meiji Japan, each trying to plant their flag on Korean soil. For Myeongseong, this conflict was less about choosing sides and more about trying to keep Korea from being carved up like the last piece of Thanksgiving turkey. She had to be as nimble as a cat on a hot tin roof, navigating the treacherous waters of international diplomacy with the grace of a ballerina and the cunning of a fox. Now, let's address the myth that Myeongseong was merely a pawn in this grand game. Sure, she was up against two heavyweight champs, but she wasn't just sitting in the corner, wringing her hands. No, she was playing a game of geopolitical chess, and her moves were anything but predictable. She recognized that the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876, which had opened Korea to Japanese influence, was like handing the keys of your house to a neighbor who'd already borrowed your lawnmower and never returned it. During the conflict, Myeongseong's rivalry with pro-Japanese factions within Korea reached a fever pitch. These factions, spurred by the promise of modernization and power, were like children in a candy store, ready to trade sovereignty for shiny new toys. But Myeongseong, ever the strategist, wasn't about to let them run amok without a fight. She sought to counterbalance Japan's influence by bolstering ties with Russia, hoping they'd provide a counterweight to Japan's ambitions. And here's where the story gets even juicier. Myeongseong's court was alive with the kind of espionage and intrigue that would make a spy novelist giddy. There were whispers of double agents and secret alliances, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other. It was like a diplomatic version of Survivor, where alliances could shift with the wind, and no one was safe from the proverbial blind side. In this climate of mistrust, Myeongseong had to be constantly on her toes. Her attempts to outwit her enemies were as much about survival as they were about strategy. She was like a master weaver, deftly threading the needle between diplomacy and deception. Her alliances with foreign powers were carefully crafted, and her ability to read the political landscape was second to none. But let's not sugarcoat it. Her strategies weren't always successful, and the stakes were as high as they come. Myeongseong's efforts to resist Japanese influence were not without their moments of tension and drama. The pro-Japanese faction within Korea wasn't just a minor nuisance. They were like a thorn in her side that kept getting deeper. These guys were all about the New World Order, and they saw Myeongseong as an obstacle to their vision. It was like a battle of old versus new, with Myeongseong trying to balance tradition with necessary change. Of course, this era of intrigue and espionage wasn't all cloak and dagger. There's an amusing tale of Myeongseong using coded messages hidden in seemingly innocuous correspondence. Think of it as the 19th century version of encryption. These messages were sent through trusted courtiers and allies, ensuring that her strategies remained under wraps. It was an ingenious way to keep her enemies guessing and her plans intact. Yet, let's not get too carried away with romanticizing her as the ultimate puppet master. The notion of Myeongseong as a cunning strategist capable of outsmarting her foes at every turn is indeed appealing, but it glosses over the harsh reality she faced. She was operating in a world where betrayal was as common as morning tea, and the best-laid plans could unravel at a moment's notice. Her story is not just one of triumph, but also of struggle and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. As the war progressed, the political landscape shifted like quicksand beneath her feet. Japan's victory in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895 was a turning point that changed everything. With China's influence waning, Japan was now the dominant power in the region, and they had their eyes firmly set on Korea. Myeongseong found herself in an increasingly precarious position, with pro-Japanese forces gaining strength and her options dwindling. But here's the kicker. Even in the face of such adversity, Myeongseong remained defiant. She wasn't about to roll over and let Japan dictate Korea's future. Her attempts to forge alliances and counterbalance Japanese influence were a testament to her tenacity and strategic mind. She was a woman who understood that the game wasn't over until the last piece was played, and she was determined to make every move count. Yet, as history would have it, her enemies were equally determined to see her removed from the equation. The tension between her and the pro-Japanese factions reached a boiling point, leading to a fateful series of events that would change the course of Korean history. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's still more to this story, and the conclusion is anything but simple. So, as the sun began to set on the 19th century, Empress Myeongseong stood at a crossroads. Her efforts to modernize Korea and navigate the treacherous waters of international politics had brought her both triumph and tragedy. She was a woman who had dared to defy the odds, to stand against the tide of change, and to fight for the future of her nation. And while her story is far from over, the next chapter promises to be just as compelling, filled with intrigue, betrayal, and the indomitable spirit of a true empress. Stay tuned, because the saga of Empress Myeongseong is only just beginning, and the tale that unfolds will be as riveting as it is poignant. As Empress Myeongseong stood at that crossroads, the plot against her thickened like a poorly made gravy, and the stakes were higher than ever. The year was 1895, and the political landscape was as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. Japan, fresh from its victory in the Sino-Japanese War, was flexing its muscles, eager to turn Korea into its own geopolitical playground. Meanwhile, Myeongseong was juggling more diplomatic balls than a circus performer with an existential crisis. Her influence was waning, and the pro-Japanese factions within Korea were circling like vultures over a wounded animal. The court was a treacherous place, filled with whispers, double dealings, and enough conspiracy theories to make a tabloid editor salivate. Myeongseong's attempts to counterbalance Japan's influence with Russian support were like trying to patch a sinking ship with duct tape. The power dynamics were shifting, and not in her favor. In the midst of this turmoil, the Empress faced a dilemma: how to maintain Korea's sovereignty without sparking a conflict that could consume the entire peninsula. Her strategies were bold but risky, like walking a tightrope over a pit of hungry tigers. She knew that the pro-Japanese factions were growing bolder by the day, emboldened by Japan's newfound dominance. It was a classic case of political Darwinism, where only the shrewdest would survive. But let's not get too caught up in the romantic notion of the lone Empress battling the forces of darkness. The cold, hard reality was that Myeongseong was up against a well-oiled machine of political ambition and foreign interference. The Japanese weren't just interested in influence. They were after control. They wanted Korea as a stepping stone for their expansionist dreams, and Myeongseong was the inconvenient obstacle in their path. Let's sprinkle in some dark humor to lighten the mood, because who doesn't love a good laugh at the absurdity of court conspiracies? Imagine, if you will, a room filled with courtiers plotting like a group of high school students planning a prank. Their meetings were more cloak and dagger than a spy thriller, with secret rendezvous and coded messages exchanged under the watchful eyes of palace guards. It was like a bad soap opera, complete with melodramatic villainy and over-the-top scheming. Now, onto the real meat of the tale, Myeongseong's assassination. The myth of her demise reads like a Gothic novel, full of shadowy figures and dramatic flair. Legend has it that she was spirited away by a band of masked assassins, her fate shrouded in mystery. But let's peel back the layers of fiction and stare reality square in the face. The truth is far less glamorous and infinitely more chilling. On October 8, 1895, in the dead of night, because naturally all good conspiracies unfold under the cover of darkness, a group of Japanese agents and Korean collaborators infiltrated Gyeongbokgung Palace. This was no amateur operation. It was meticulously planned with military precision, a grim dance of calculated moves and ruthless efficiency. The assassins, led by Myeongseong, Japan's minister to Korea, made their way to the Queen's quarters with one goal in mind: to eliminate the Empress and solidify Japan's grip on the Korean peninsula. Myeongseong's end was brutal and swift, a stark reminder that in the world of high-stakes politics, human life was often just another pawn in a much larger game. There was no dramatic last stand, no tearful farewell. Her death was a cold-blooded act of political expediency, a stark contrast to the romanticized accounts that paint her as a martyr cloaked in mystery. The assassins didn't just kill her, they desecrated her body and attempted to erase her from history, as if blotting out a troublesome footnote in their conquest narrative. And what of the international intrigue that surrounded her death? The foreign powers, ever the opportunists, responded with the kind of righteous indignation that can only be mustered when one's own interests are at stake. Russia, ever eager to counter Japan's influence, used the assassination as a rallying cry to bolster its own position in Korea. The Western powers, meanwhile, feigned shock and horror while secretly negotiating their own slices of the geopolitical pie. It's worth noting that the economic context of this period was just as cutthroat as the political scene. Japan was on a modernization spree, its industrial revolution churning out advancements at a breakneck pace. Korea, by contrast, was still catching up, its infrastructure like a patchwork quilt of old and new. The power struggle was as much about economic dominance as it was about political control. Japan needed Korea's resources and strategic location to fuel its ambitions, and Myeongseong's resistance was a thorn in their side. Let's take a moment to debunk another myth: the idea that Myeongseong was a helpless victim swept away by the tide of history. In reality, she was a formidable opponent whose vision for Korea threatened to disrupt the carefully laid plans of those around her. Her assassination wasn't just an end. It was a calculated move in a much larger game, a testament to the brutal calculus of power. So why do the myths persist? Because they offer a narrative that's far more palatable than the messy truth. The idea of a lone empress standing against the forces of darkness is a compelling story, one that captures the imagination and tugs at the heartstrings. But the truth, the cold, hard reality of political machinations and ruthless ambition, is a reminder that history is often as brutal as it is fascinating. As the dust settled on the events of that fateful night, the world was left to ponder the implications of Myeongseong's death. The power vacuum she left behind was quickly filled by pro-Japanese forces, eager to reshape Korea in their image. The Empress's vision for a modern, sovereign Korea was buried with her, a dream snuffed out by the harsh realities of imperialism and geopolitical ambition. Yet, even as her influence waned, Myeongseong's legacy endured. She remains a symbol of resistance and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one can still stand firm in their beliefs. Her story is a testament to the complexities of power and the human spirit's capacity to defy the odds, even when the deck is stacked against them. As we inch closer to the final chapter of her tale, it's clear that Myeongseong's impact on Korean history is far from a mere footnote. Her life and death shaped the trajectory of a nation, leaving an indelible mark on the annals of history. Though the Empress herself may be gone, her story continues to resonate, a poignant reminder of the price of ambition and the enduring struggle for sovereignty. Stay tuned, because the saga of Empress Myeongseong is not yet finished, and the tale that unfolds promises to be as riveting as it is heart-wrenching. The saga of Empress Myeongseong, often cloaked in the shroud of myth and melodrama, leaves us pondering not only the tragic circumstances of her demise, but also the enduring impact of her life on Korean history. Her assassination may have been a calculated move on the geopolitical chessboard, but it was hardly the end of her story. In fact, it sparked a firestorm of nationalism that would burn well into the 20th century and beyond, a phoenix rising from the ashes, if you will. Let's start by examining the immediate aftermath of her death. The political vacuum was filled with pro-Japanese forces faster than you can say power grab. But the Empress's influence lingered like a stubborn ghost. Her murder galvanized a nascent Korean nationalist movement, a coalition of scholars, activists, and ordinary citizens who rallied around the idea of self-determination. The outrage over her assassination was akin to the final straw that breaks the camel's back, igniting a collective fervor for change. In the years that followed, Korea's path to modernization and independence was fraught with challenges. The Japanese annexation in 1910 turned Korea into a colony, an era that lasted until the end of World War II in 1945. Yet, during this tumultuous period, the seeds of nationalism planted in the wake of Myeongseong's death began to take root. Her legacy became a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance against foreign domination. The Korean independence movement, with its myriad factions and philosophies, found a unifying figure in the Empress, whose life and death underscored the high stakes of sovereignty. And here's where things get really interesting. Empress Myeongseong's story doesn't just dwell in dusty history books. Oh no, she has been resurrected time and again in the world of media and pop culture. From films and television dramas to novels and musicals, her life has been retold and reimagined in countless ways. Each retelling adds a new layer to her legend, blending fact with fiction in a way that keeps audiences captivated. It's like the enduring appeal of a classic novel. No matter how many times you read it, you always find something new to appreciate. But let's not get swept away by the romanticized portrayals. While the idea of a lone empress standing against the tide of imperialism makes for a compelling narrative, it's crucial to remember the historical context. Myeongseong was not a solitary figure. She was part of a broader tapestry of political intrigue and cultural change. Her story is as much about the collective struggle of the Korean people as it is about her individual actions. The mythologized accounts often gloss over the harsh realities of her time, painting her as a martyr without acknowledging the complexities of her reign. So, why does her legend endure? Well, it taps into universal themes that resonate across cultures and generations: the fight for justice, the courage to defy the odds, and the quest for identity. Myeongseong's life embodies these themes, making her a symbol not just for Koreans, but for anyone who has ever dared to challenge the status quo. Her story is a reminder that history is not merely a collection of dates and events, but a living narrative that continues to shape our understanding of the world. As we reflect on Myeongseong's legacy, it's worth considering how her story resonates in today's global landscape. In an era of rapid change and geopolitical uncertainty, her life serves as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope. The challenges she faced, balancing tradition with modernization, navigating complex alliances, and asserting national identity, are as relevant now as they were over a century ago. Her story invites us to consider the delicate balance of power and the role of individual agency in the broader sweep of history. And there you have it, folks, the saga of Empress Myeongseong, a tale of intrigue, ambition, and resilience that continues to captivate and inspire. Her life was a testament to the complexities of power and the indomitable spirit of a nation on the brink of transformation. As we close this chapter, let's remember her not just as a figure of mythic proportions, but as a real woman who dared to dream of a different future. Her story is a reminder that history is not just about the past, but a lens through which we can understand the present and envision the future. So here's to Empress Myeongseong, a queen, a strategist, and an enduring symbol of Korea's fight for sovereignty. Picture yourself on the sweeping steppes of Eurasia, where the sky seems as endless as your grandmother's stories about her youth. It's the 7th century BCE, and you're part of a people who are as synonymous with the nomadic lifestyle as a camel is with the desert, the Scythians. These folks didn't just survive the harsh landscape, they thrived in it, becoming one of the great enigmas of ancient history. Now, let's set the scene. You're living in a world where the term brutal is more of a job requirement than a personality flaw. The Scythians were the original no-nonsense group of people, known for their fearsome reputation and ruthless efficiency. These attributes weren't just for show. They were critical survival tactics. When your existence depends on the whims of the weather and the fertility of the land, you learn to adapt or perish. And adapt the Scythians did, with a level of ingenuity that would put most modern startups to shame. The Scythians roamed an expanse that would boggle the mind even today, stretching from what is now southern Russia to the edges of the Black Sea. That's about 500 miles, or roughly the distance from New York to Los Angeles. No small feat when your primary mode of transport is a horse, and the roads are about as developed as a teenager's sense of responsibility. But for the Scythians, the horse was more than just a means of travel. It was their partner, their companion, and sometimes their dinner. In fact, horse meat was a staple in their diet, and they were known to drink fermented mare's milk, known as kumis. Delicious, perhaps not by today's standards, but it sure kept the scurvy at bay. The Scythians were masters of the steppe, a title not easily earned. They had a knack for living off the land, and their survival skills were honed to a razor's edge. In a place where the weather could turn on you faster than a reality TV contestant, they developed a culture that was resilient, resourceful, and more than a little intimidating. And yes, they were warriors par excellence. The Greek historian Herodotus, often referred to as the father of history, or the father of lies, depending on who you ask, described them as invincible and unreachable, which, coming from the Greeks, was high praise indeed. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the romance of it all. The Scythians were brutal, and their reputation wasn't just hearsay. They were known for their practice of scalping enemies, a gruesome trophy that served as a reminder not to mess with them. And if that wasn't enough, they'd sometimes make drinking cups out of human skulls. Talk about recycling. Yet, behind the tales of terror was a deeply complex society. They had their own form of government, one that eschewed the sedentary life of kings and castles for a more fluid and adaptable structure. Power came not from a throne, but from mobility, military prowess, and the ability to lead people across vast swaths of land. They had no written language, but their art, found on everything from gold jewelry to painted pottery, speaks volumes about a sophisticated culture with a rich mythology. Now, let's talk mythology and reality. The Scythians are often depicted as the quintessential barbarian hordes, living on the fringes of the civilized world. But let's not forget who was writing these histories. Mostly Greeks and Romans who saw anyone not wearing a toga as a little suspect. The Scythians weren't just mindless marauders. They were traders and craftsmen. They had a knack for metalwork, that was the envy of many a sedentary society. Gold was their medium of choice, and they crafted intricate jewelry that would make even the most flamboyant rapper blush. And here's where the line between myth and reality starts to blur. The stories of their brutality made for good campfire tales, but they also served a political purpose. They kept potential invaders at bay. After all, who wants to face down a people who might turn your noggin into a mug? But in reality, the Scythians knew the value of diplomacy and trade. They were as likely to offer a hand as they were to draw a sword, depending on what the situation called for. As you sit by the fire, listening to the elders recount tales of battles won and lost, you can't help but wonder about the world beyond the horizon. The Scythians were not isolationists by any stretch. They had dealings with the Greeks, Persians, and later the Romans. Each interaction brought new influences, new technologies, and new ideas. They were like the original global citizens, trading goods, stories, and occasionally hostages. The early history of the Scythians is as much about survival as it is about conquest. They were a people forged in the crucible of a harsh environment, learning to bend but not break. Their adaptability was their greatest strength, allowing them to navigate the shifting sands of power and politics with a deftness that would make Machiavelli nod in approval. They understood that to survive, you had to be as changeable as the winds of the steppe. So, as you drift off to sleep, remember that the Scythians were more than just their reputation. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that sometimes the roughest edges hide the deepest complexities. You might not have a horse or a gold necklace, but you've got the stories, and in the end, that's what keeps history alive. And so, as the embers of the campfire glow and the tales of yore sing you to sleep, let's not forget that the Scythian story is as much about the jingle of coins and the clatter of hooves as it is about myth and legend. You see, the Scythian economy wasn't just a wild ride of blood and glory. These folks had a knack for turning war into wealth, a skill that could make even the savviest hedge fund manager raise an eyebrow. The Scythians were the ultimate side hustlers of the ancient world. Warfare wasn't just a necessity, it was a business model. They didn't just raid for the thrill or the practice, although that was probably a bonus. Nope, they raided because the spoils of war were like finding a pot of gold at the end of a particularly bloody rainbow. The plunder was real, and it came in many forms: gold, livestock, and even people. Yes, human capital in the most literal sense. Slavery might be a dirty word today, but back then, it was just another line on the Scythian balance sheet. But let's not paint them as mere pillagers. The Scythians were also master traders, a fact often overshadowed by their reputation as fierce warriors. They had trade networks that spanned continents, linking the Far East with Europe in a web of commerce that would make Amazon blush. From the Silk Roads of China to the olive groves of Greece, the Scythians were the middlemen of the ancient world. Picture them as the original global supply chain managers, minus the spreadsheets and quarterly reports. And let's talk logistics. The Scythians didn't just rely on brute strength. They had technology that gave them an edge. Meet the composite bow, a weapon as deadly as it was complex. Made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, this bow was the ancient equivalent of a modern multi-tool. It was compact and powerful, capable of piercing armor at distances that would have made their enemies rethink their life choices. The Greeks and Persians learned the hard way that a Scythian on horseback, armed with one of these bad boys, was not something you wanted to face on an open field. Ah, the horse. It wasn't just the Scythian version of a family car. It was their partner in both trade and war. They were like the original equine entrepreneurs, using horses to transport goods across vast distances and to outmaneuver enemies. In fact, the Scythians were so synonymous with their steeds that they were often depicted in Greek art as centaurs, the ultimate mythological mashup of man and beast. But unlike the centaurs, the Scythians were all too real, and their mastery of horseback warfare was legendary. Now, let's crunch some numbers. The Scythians measured wealth not in gold coins, but in livestock. In a world where coinage was a novelty, owning a herd was like having a diversified investment portfolio. Cattle, sheep, and horses were the currencies of the steppe, and the Scythians were like financial wizards, multiplying their assets through trade and conquest. This wasn't just about survival. It was about building a legacy, one that could be passed down through generations like a family heirloom. Their trade routes were as vast as their ambitions. They didn't just connect darts on a map. They created a network that linked cultures and economies in a way that would make a modern globalization advocate nod approvingly. From the jade of China to the wine of Greece, the Scythians were in the thick of it, trading goods and ideas with a deftness that would make them the envy of any MBA program. They were the original cross-cultural pollinators, spreading knowledge and commerce across continents. But let's not get too carried away with the romance of it all. The Scythian economy was as brutal as it was brilliant. Their reliance on warfare meant that peace was often bad for business. When the swords stopped clashing, the coffers stopped ringing. It was a cycle as old as time. Peace meant poverty, war meant wealth. It's a harsh reality, but one that the Scythians understood all too well. They were like the original economists, balancing the scales of war and trade with a pragmatism that was as cold as the Siberian winds. As you drift further into the night, remember that the Scythians were more than just warriors and traders. They were a people who understood the delicate balance of power and prosperity, a balance that kept them at the top of their game for centuries. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, the Scythians carved out a niche for themselves with a blend of brutality and brilliance that still echoes through the annals of history. They weren't just surviving the sands of time, they were shaping them. And as their story unfolds, you'll see that the Scythians were more than just a footnote in history. They were a force, a phenomenon, and a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity. So, let's dig deeper into the Scythian social tapestry, a society where the roles weren't as rigid as that last jigsaw puzzle you tried to solve. This might come as a surprise, but gender equality wasn't a concept invented by 20th century activists. The Scythians were practicing it on the steppes, while the rest of the world was still debating whether women should be allowed to own property. In Scythian culture, women weren't just holding down the fort. They were riding into battle, bow and arrow in hand, like something out of a historical epic. Enter the Scythian women warriors, or as some might say, the original Wonder Women. Forget the Hollywood glitz and glamour. These women were the real deal. Archaeological digs, most notably the Kurgans or burial mounds, have unearthed remains of women buried with weapons and armor. These weren't just ornamental pieces. They were as functional as a Swiss army knife. And the Greeks, never ones to miss a good story, might have been inspired by these warrior women when they spun tales of the Amazons. Herodotus, our favorite ancient gossip, even mentioned them, describing Scythian women who fought alongside men. But this wasn't just some ancient PR campaign. DNA analysis of remains from sites like the Pakrovka Kurgans shows that up to 37% of Scythian women were warriors. That's right, these women weren't just in the backlines. They were out there in the thick of it, proving that bravery wasn't bound by gender. But hold on, before we start romanticizing this as some kind of egalitarian paradise, let's take a closer look. True, Scythian women had more freedom than most of their ancient counterparts. No one was locking them up in towers or making them churn out endless tapestries. But that didn't mean life was a walk in the park. The harsh realities of nomadic life meant everyone pulled their weight, regardless of gender. It was survival, plain and simple. If you could wield a sword or shoot an arrow, you did so, man or woman. The steppe wasn't exactly forgiving, and everyone had to contribute to the tribe's survival. Now, let's shift our gaze to the Scythian societal structure. If you think this was just a bunch of clans running wild, think again. The Scythians had a sophisticated social system, albeit one that would make medieval monarchs scratch their heads. Leadership was fluid, based on meritocracy rather than hereditary privilege. Imagine a society where your ability to lead was more important than the family tree, a concept that might still resonate today. This wasn't a society ruled by the whims of birthright. It was governed by ability and respect. The Scythians understood that leadership wasn't about sitting on a throne, but about guiding your people through the literal and metaphorical storms. Now, let's talk Kurgans, those fascinating burial mounds that scattered the steppe like ancient breadcrumbs. These weren't just piles of dirt. They were Scythian skyscrapers, markers of status and belief. A Kurgan could range from a modest heap to a monumental earthwork that took a small army to construct. The larger the Kurgan, the more important the person buried within it. But these mounds weren't just about showing off. They tell us a lot about Scythian beliefs. Inside these earthen monuments, archaeologists have found everything from golden treasures to everyday items, suggesting a belief in an afterlife where the deceased would need their worldly goods. Think of it as an ancient version of you can't take it with you, except the Scythians believed you could. The Kurgans also reveal the Scythians' social stratification. The elite were buried with exquisite gold artifacts, a testament to their status and wealth. But here's the kicker. Even commoners got Kurgans, albeit less grandiose versions. This egalitarian approach to death reflects the Scythian belief that everyone, regardless of rank, had a place in the afterlife. It's a fascinating glimpse into a culture where death was the great equalizer, a concept that still resonates today. The Kurgans are like time capsules, preserving the intricacies of Scythian life in a way that written records never could. But let's not forget the practical side of things. Building a Kurgan wasn't just about honoring the dead. It was a community effort, a way to bring people together. Imagine the logistics of constructing a massive mound on the open steppe with nothing but manpower and determination. It was an exercise in unity, a chance for the tribe to come together for a common cause. In a way, the Kurgans were as much about the living as they were about the dead. As we piece together the Scythian puzzle, it's clear that theirs was a society of fascinating contradictions. They were warriors and traders, egalitarians and hierarchs, brutal yet sophisticated. Their story is one of resilience and adaptation, a testament to the human spirit's ability to thrive in the harshest conditions. And as the embers of their history continue to glow, we're left with a deeper understanding of a people who were more than just the sum of their legends. They were a force to be reckoned with, shaping the landscapes they roamed and the histories they touched. As we continue to unravel the Scythian saga, let's keep our eyes open for the next chapters in their remarkable tale. And speaking of tales that defy time, let's steer our Scythian steeds toward the political gamesmanship that shaped their interactions with neighbors. Now, if you think ancient diplomacy was all about grand banquets and handshake deals, think again. For the Scythians, political dynamics were like a high-stakes game of chess played on horseback, with all the subtlety of a cavalry charge. First up in our diplomatic dossier, the Persians. The Persian Empire, a behemoth of its time, stretching from the bustling marketplaces of Anatolia to the far reaches of the Indus Valley. Imagine trying to negotiate with a neighbor who not only has more land than you can gallop across in a week, but also a penchant for empire building that rivals any modern-day superpower. It's like trying to strike a deal with a real estate tycoon who's got their eyes on your backyard. The Scythian encounter with Persia is a tale as old as empires themselves, one of conflict, strategy, and a dash of bravado. Circa 513 BCE, Darius I, the Persian king, decided it was time to introduce the Scythians to his growing empire. Spoiler alert, the Scythians weren't exactly thrilled about this unsolicited invitation. Darius, never one to shy away from a challenge, mustered an army so vast it reportedly took 7 days to cross a single bridge over the Bosphorus. Talk about making an entrance. But here's the kicker. The Scythians, with their mobile lifestyle and hit-and-run tactics, turned this grand Persian campaign into a continental wild goose chase. Rather than meeting Darius head-on, they employed a scorched earth policy, retreating into the vastness of the steppe and leaving nothing but barren land in their wake. It was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare, centuries before the term even existed. Think of it as an ancient version of Catch Me If You Can, but with a lot more at stake than a weakened box office. Despite Darius's best efforts, the Scythians proved elusive. Their knowledge of the terrain, combined with their mobility, left the Persian forces exhausted and overextended. It's like they took the page about fight or flight and rewrote it into their own strategic manual. Why choose? Just do both. Eventually, Darius had to retreat, his grand conquest thwarted by a people who understood that sometimes the best way to win a battle is to never engage in it at all. These encounters with the Persians weren't just about territorial disputes. They were lessons in adaptability and resilience. The Scythians learned to navigate the geopolitical landscape as deftly as they did their own homeland. Their ability to maintain independence in the face of such formidable foes spoke volumes about their understanding of political and military strategy. They were like the Houdinis of the steppe, slipping out of the grasp of even the most determined conquerors. But let's not romanticize this as an endless string of victories. The Scythians faced constant pressure, not just from the Persians, but from a litany of neighbors with varying degrees of hospitality. The Greeks, for instance, were both trading partners and occasional adversaries. It's a bit like living next door to someone who sometimes borrows sugar and other times tries to annex your garden shed. The Scythian relationship with the Greeks was as complex as it was profitable. On one hand, the Greeks admired Scythian craftsmanship and military prowess. On the other, they feared their unpredictable nature. The Greeks' own historian Herodotus recounted tales that painted the Scythians as noble savages, a mix of admiration and condescension that's all too familiar in today's narratives about exotic cultures. Economically, the Scythians and Greeks engaged in a mutually beneficial trade network. Greek pottery and wine flowed into Scythian hands, while grain and furs went the other way. It was a relationship of necessity, with both sides benefiting from a steady exchange of goods. But make no mistake, this wasn't just a quaint barter system. The Scythians understood market dynamics and leveraged their position as intermediaries between Europe and Asia, like seasoned traders on Wall Street. They knew that controlling the flow of goods meant wielding power, and they did so with aplomb. And then there were the interactions with the Thracians, another group of fierce warriors who shared the Scythians' penchant for equestrian warfare and complex hairstyles. The Thracians and Scythians found themselves in frequent skirmishes, each testing the other's mettle. Picture it as a game of chess where both sides occasionally flipped the board just for fun. Despite these frequent clashes, there was also a measure of respect between the two groups. They understood that sometimes it was better to break bread, or in their case, perhaps a fermented mare's milk, than to break bones. These diplomatic dances with Thracians and others were a testament to the Scythians' ability to pick their battles, both literally and figuratively. They knew that diplomacy wasn't just about avoiding conflict. It was about knowing when to fight, when to trade, and when to simply walk away. In the grand tapestry of their history, the Scythians' political interactions were as integral to their survival as their prowess on horseback. They adeptly navigated the pressures from surrounding empires and tribes, proving time and again that the pen, or the diplomatic envoy, could indeed be mightier than the sword, or, in their case, the composite bow. As we wrap up this section of our Scythian saga, it's clear that their story is one of strategic genius as much as it is of martial prowess. Their ability to balance warfare with diplomacy, to blend resistance with engagement, was key to their enduring presence on the steppes. They didn't just ride the winds of change, they directed them, shaping their destiny with the same skill and precision they showed in everything else. So, as we look forward to unraveling more of their tale, remember that the Scythians were masters not just of the land they roamed, but of the complex human interactions that defined their world. They were a people who understood that the past was not just a series of battles won or lost, but a rich tapestry of choices, alliances, and strategies that continue to echo through history. And as the story unfolds, we'll see that the Scythians were not just figures of legend, but real players on the ancient stage, negotiating their place with a deftness that would make even the most seasoned diplomat take note. As the Scythians galloped through history, their story was as much about transformation as it was about triumph. But like all great tales, it had to face its own final chapters. So, let's saddle up and ride into the decline of this once mighty nomadic empire, a saga that reads like a Shakespearean tragedy with a splash of reality TV drama. The winds of change began to blow across the Eurasian steppes around the 3rd century BCE, and the Scythians, masters of adaptation, found themselves caught in a tempest of new powers and shifting alliances. The rise of the Sarmatians, a fierce group with a penchant for cavalry warfare and a flair for dramatic hairstyles, began to squeeze the Scythians out of their traditional strongholds. Picture it as a hostile takeover, but instead of boardrooms and stark options, it was all about spears and saddles. The Sarmatians had what you might call a strategic advantage, more warriors and better weapons. They brought with them the heavy cavalry, a game-changer in the open steppes where mobility was everything. It was like the Scythians suddenly found themselves playing chess against a grandmaster who'd just read the entire playbook. The pressure was on, and it was relentless. Now, let's not get too misty-eyed about this being a clean cut. The Scythians didn't just pack up their yurts and ride off into the sunset. Oh no, they fought tooth and nail, but the relentless tide of Sarmatian warriors was a bit like trying to hold back a flood with a leaky bucket. Ultimately, Many Scythians were absorbed into the Sarmatian culture, a cultural merger, if you will. Others were pushed further into the Crimean Peninsula, sort of Scythian retirement community, where they could reminisce about the good old days of domination and daring raids. But the Sarmatians weren't the only new kids on the block. Enter the Goths, around the 3rd century CE, with their superior military tactics and a desire for expansion that made them the rising stars of the steppes. They swooped in like a storm, and the remaining Scythians, now a shadow of their former glory, were swept aside like autumn leaves. The Goths didn't just conquer, they assimilated, weaving the Scythians into the fabric of their own culture, much like a victorious team absorbing the star players of the league they just defeated. Yet, the Scythians didn't vanish without leaving behind a legacy that would echo through the corridors of time. They were the original influencers, setting trends in warfare and trade that would be emulated by countless others. Their military tactics, particularly their use of mounted archery, were adopted by everyone from the Mongols to the Ottoman Empire. It was like they'd written the ultimate guide on how to conquer the world from horseback, and everyone else just followed suit. Moreover, their impact extended beyond the battlefield. The Scythians were instrumental in the development of what would eventually become the Silk Road, a trade network that linked the East and West, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and even diseases. They were like the ancient world's version of Amazon Prime, delivering exotic goods across vast distances at breakneck speeds. They understood the power of connection long before globalization was a buzzword, and this web of commerce laid the foundations for cultural exchanges that shaped the world. Among the enduring myths left behind is the romanticized image of the Scythians as noble savages, a narrative that's as compelling as it is misleading. The Greeks and Romans, with their penchant for storytelling, painted them as both terrifying and tantalizing, a cocktail of admiration and fear that's become a staple in tales of the exotic other. Yet, behind these legends were real people with a complex society that understood the intricacies of power, trade, and survival in a world that was constantly changing. The Scythian legacy also includes their art, a testament to their cultural sophistication. Their intricate gold jewelry and vibrant pottery weren't just decorative. They were a form of communication, a way of telling stories in a world without a written language. These artifacts continue to capture the imagination, offering a glimpse into a society that was as rich in culture as it was in cunning. So, what can modern societies learn from the rise and fall of the Scythians? For starters, their story is a powerful reminder that adaptability is key to survival. In a world where the only constant is change, the ability to pivot and evolve is as vital today as it was on the ancient steppes. The Scythians thrived because they understood this, turning challenges into opportunities with a finesse that would make any modern entrepreneur nod in approval. Moreover, their tale underscores the importance of cultural exchange. The Scythians didn't just conquer, they connected, fostering relationships that transcended borders and bridged cultures. In our increasingly interconnected world, their legacy serves as a blueprint for building bridges instead of walls, for embracing diversity as a source of strength rather than a threat. As we wrap up this epic journey through the world of the Scythians, it's clear that their story is more than just a historical footnote. It's a testament to the enduring power of innovation, resilience, and human spirit. They were more than just warriors on horseback. They were architects of a legacy that continues to resonate, reminding us that even the mightiest empires rise and fall, but their stories live on, shaping the world in ways we're still discovering. And so, as you close your eyes and drift into dreams of golden steppes and galloping horses, remember the Scythians. Remember their tales of triumph and their lessons of resilience. In the echoes of history, their legacy endures, a reminder that the past is not just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry of human experiences that continue to inform our present and inspire our future. In the bustling chaos of 742 AD Europe, where kingdoms rose and fell like dominoes at a toddler's tea party, a boy named Charles was born. Now, you might know him as Charlemagne, or Charles the Great if you're feeling fancy. But back then, he was just another kid with a complicated family and a future as uncertain as a medieval weather forecast. His dad was Pepin the Short, a man whose name suggests he needed a little boost on the throne. But don't let that fool you. Pepin was a powerhouse in Frankish politics, muscle-bound and ambitious. Charles grew up in a world where family drama wasn't just whispered about at the local tavern. It was splashed across battlefields and royal courts. When your father is a king who ousted the last Merovingian ruler, yes, those dudes with the long hair and short reins, it sets a certain tone for family gatherings. Charles had a brother, Charlemagne, and together they were the Frankish equivalent of a sibling rivalry reality show, except with fewer cupcakes and more conquests. The death of Pepin in 768 AD turned the family drama up to 11. The realm was split between Charles and Charlemagne, and if you think sharing a kingdom sounds like a recipe for disaster, you'd be absolutely correct. While Charles was off cementing his reputation as a military whiz, Charlemagne's untimely death in 771 AD left Charles holding the whole Frankish pie. Some say Charlemagne might have had help kicking the bucket, but who needs a true crime podcast when you've got medieval politics? Charles wasn't just about battles and brotherly betrayals. The man had a serious fashion sense, one that might have given the Met Gala a run for its money. Adored elaborate cloaks, think more Game of Thrones than Project Runway, but couldn't stand trousers. It's like he was the medieval version of a mullet, business up top, party down below. His sartorial choices aside, Charles had his eyes on a prize much grander than just Frankish lands. He wanted to unify Europe, and not just for the free cheese and wine. Now, let's talk about the legendary side of Charlemagne. Tales abound of his superhuman strength, like some kind of medieval superhero. But let's pump the brakes on that mythic narrative. Charles was no Hercules, but he was definitely a strategic mastermind. His military campaigns weren't just about flexing muscle, they were meticulously planned operations. Take the conquest of the Lombards in 774 AD. Instead of brawn, he used brains, negotiating with the Pope and using the Alps like his personal chessboard. The result, a swift victory and a new shiny crown for his collection. Charlemagne's early life was a cocktail of ambition, ruthless politics, and a dash of fashion flair. His rise to power was anything but straightforward, filled with enough plot twists to make a soap opera jealous. But through all the chaos, one thing became clear. Charles wasn't just playing the Game of Thrones, he was rewriting the rulebook. As he set out to unify Europe, his legacy as a military genius and a complex character was just beginning to unfold. And trust me, things were about to get even more interesting. With the ink barely dry on his newly acquired Lombard crown, Charlemagne turned his gaze to the untamed wilds of Saxony, a region that seemed to have a personal vendetta against the idea of Frankish unity. The Saxons, a fierce and fragmented bunch, were less interested in unification and more into their pagan rituals, which, let's face it, were far less bureaucratic. Charles saw this as a golden opportunity to expand his influence, while the Saxons saw it as an excellent excuse to sharpen their axes. Now, when it comes to military conquests, Charlemagne had a go-to strategy that could best be described as persuasive. But not in the way you'd convince your friend to watch the latest Netflix series. His preferred negotiation tool was a large sword, often accompanied by a convert or else policy that was as straightforward as it sounds. Think of it as the medieval version of a door-to-door salesman who won't take no for an answer, except the product was Christianity, and the alternative was decidedly unpleasant. The Saxon Wars, which stretched over 3 exhausting decades, were less a series of battles, and more like a really long, really aggressive game of whack-a-mole. Charlemagne would march in, subdue a rebellious faction, and before you could say, Holy Roman Empire, another would pop up. The logistics of managing such a prolonged conflict were nothing short of Herculean. Picture this, commanding an army that needed to be fed, armed, and motivated, all while traversing the thick forests and treacherous rivers of Saxony. Uber Eats wasn't an option, and neither was running to the nearest medieval drive-through. Instead, Charles relied on a complex system of supply lines and the occasional liberation of local resources. Liberation here being a polite term for taking what they needed, and then some. Keeping troops motivated was another challenge altogether. Charlemagne wasn't handing out participation trophies. He was offering something far more compelling: land. Soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle could look forward to a chunk of conquered territory, a prize that came with its own set of headaches, sure, but also with a status upgrade from foot soldier to landowner. It was like winning a medieval lottery, with a slightly higher chance of getting an axe to the face. Despite the daunting logistics and the stubborn Saxons, Charlemagne's military machine was remarkably effective. But let's not get carried away with the myth of the invincible king. For every victory, there were setbacks that proved Charlemagne, while a strategic genius, was still very much human. One of his less-than-stellar moments came during the Battle of Suntal in 782 AD, where his forces were ambushed and suffered significant losses. A stark reminder that even the mightiest can fall victim to the chaos of war. The legend of an always victorious Charlemagne is tempting, but the reality was far more complex. His campaigns were a blend of brilliant strategies and occasional blunders, each contributing to his growth as a ruler. It's easy to romanticize the image of a king who never lost, but the truth is, it was his ability to learn from mistakes and adapt that truly set him apart. As Charlemagne continued his Saxon campaign, he wasn't just fighting a war of swords and shields. He was waging a cultural battle, one that sought to weave the disparate threads of Europe into a single, cohesive tapestry. The Saxon Wars were a microcosm of a larger vision, a united Europe under one faith and one leader. The appeal of this vision is undeniable, a medieval dream that still resonates today. Yet, beneath the romance of unification lay the harsh reality of conquest, conversion, and the relentless march of history. But don't think for a second that Charlemagne's story ends here. This was only one chapter in a life filled with ambition, battles, and a quest for a legacy that would echo through the ages. As we leave the Saxon forests behind, we're about to dive into the next stage of Charlemagne's journey, a tale of politics, innovation, and the shaping of Europe as we know it. Stay tuned, because if you thought the Saxon Wars were intense, you haven't seen anything yet. Stepping out of the wooded chaos of the Saxon Wars, Charlemagne faced a new battlefield, one of governance, where the weapons were laws, and the skirmishes involved nobles and not swords. A man Charlemagne wasn't just about swinging a sword. He was about swinging the whole empire towards something resembling order. This king had a vision, and no, it wasn't just the fantasy of a giant cheese wheel or endless goblets of wine. It was the dream of a unified Europe that didn't just look like a patchwork quilt of duchies and counties, but actually functioned like a coherent realm. First up in his grand plan was setting up a system that might sound familiar to anyone who's ever had to fill out a TPS report: administration. Charlemagne organized his empire into regions called counties, managed by counts who were essentially the medieval equivalent of regional managers. Think of it as a massive game of Risk, but with real-world stakes and no cozy living room to retreat to after a defeat. These counts had significant autonomy, but were expected to enforce the king's decrees, collect taxes, and keep the peace, or at least as much peace as you could find in medieval Europe, where a family feud might involve actual feudal armies. Now, Charlemagne wasn't about to let these counts run wild like teenagers at a medieval carnival. So, he introduced a little something called the Missi Dominici, a pair of roving inspectors, one secular and one religious, who travelled around ensuring the counts were towing the line. Imagine them as the original buddy cop duo, but instead of badges, they had the king's seal, and instead of crime scenes, they visited drafty castles and muddy villages. Their job was to report back to Charlemagne, keeping the administrators on their toes and the empire clicking along like a well-oiled, albeit very medieval, machine. But wait, there's more. Charlemagne wasn't just content with a bureaucratic overhaul. He wanted his empire to be the cultural and intellectual heart of Europe. Enter the Carolingian Renaissance, a period where art, literature, and education flourished under his rule. Charlemagne dragged scholars from across the continent to his court, turning it into a medieval think tank. The aim? To revive the classical knowledge that had been gathering dust since the Roman Empire took its final bow. Charlemagne, ever the overachiever, even decided to get in on the educational action himself. He was determined to learn to read and write, although, spoiler alert, he never quite conquered the latter. Picture this: a king who could conquer nations but struggled to conquer the alphabet. It's the kind of irony that keeps history interesting. His enthusiasm, however, was infectious, and under his reign, literacy and learning spread like wildfire, or at least like a controlled burn across Europe. Now, let's talk money. Charlemagne had a revolutionary idea: standardized currency. In a world where bartering was as common as breathing, he introduced the silver denarius, aiming to create a consistent currency across his empire. It was an ambitious project, considering some of his subjects still preferred trading chickens for bread or goats for carts. The denarius was supposed to be worth 1/12 of a solidus, another coin, but in practice, these values fluctuated like today's stock market. The appeal of this plan was undeniable. Unified currency meant easier trade and taxation. But in reality, getting everyone on the same monetary page was about as easy as teaching a cat to fetch. Charlemagne's effort to unify the empire economically had its hiccups. Regions with strong local economies were reluctant to switch to the new system, clinging to their age-old bartering habits like a medieval security blanket. Yet the dream of a unified economic structure was a step towards the Europe we know today. One currency to rule them all, or at least a rough draft of that idea. In all these efforts, Charlemagne was rewriting the playbook of kingship. He wasn't just a warrior king. He was a ruler with a vision, someone who saw beyond the battlefield to the possibilities of culture, administration, and trade. His empire was a living experiment in governance, a precursor to modern states. But let's not get swept away by the grandeur of it all. For every success, there were still plenty of medieval mishaps, rebellious counts, economic disparities, and the stubborn resistance of tradition. Charlemagne's story is a tapestry woven with ambition, intellect, and yes, a fair share of medieval chaos. He was a man who tried to bring order to the disorderly, to educate the unlettered, and to standardize the unpredictable. His legacy is both romantic and real, a testament to the complexities of leadership and the enduring appeal of a united Europe. As we continue this journey through Charlemagne's life, remember that this king wasn't just dreaming of an empire. He was building it, one law, one coin, and one lesson at a time. And trust me, this saga isn't over yet. Stay tuned for more tales of triumphs, trials, and a king who dared to dream big. Charlemagne wasn't just stitching together an empire. He was also weaving a personal life as tangled as a medieval tapestry. Now, let's dive into the soap opera that was Charlemagne's domestic affairs. You see, Charlemagne's love life had all the makings of a tabloid sensation. Forget reality TV. This was reality royalty. The man had not one, not two, but a whopping 5 wives over his lifetime. Each marriage was less about candlelit dinners and more about political chess, with alliances being the name of the game. His first wife, Himmeltrude, was more of a starter marriage, swiftly followed by Desiderata, whom he ditched faster than a New Year's resolution. Next came Hildegard, who bore him a small army of children before passing away. Then came Fastrada, who was, shall we say, less popular with the nobles, and finally Luitgard, who rounded out this matrimonial carousel. But Charlemagne didn't stop at wives. He also had numerous concubines, because why settle for complexity when you can have chaos? The result, a veritable horde of offspring, around 18 known children, though the exact count is as murky as a medieval moat. This brood was a mix of legitimate and illegitimate children, all swirling around in a dynastic dance that would make any family reunion a logistical nightmare. Charlemagne's approach to parenting was as unconventional as his love life. He was a doting father who took a hands-on approach, ensuring his sons were trained in the art of war and governance. His daughters, meanwhile, were kept close, unmarried, and reportedly spoiled, which raised more than a few medieval eyebrows. But Charlemagne had his reasons. Marrying them off could lead to pesky political rivals down the line. So, instead, he kept them at court, where they could enjoy the perks of royal life without the hassle of in-laws. As if juggling an empire and a football team of children wasn't enough, Charlemagne also had to navigate his relationship with the papacy, particularly with Pope Leo Roman III. You'd think being tight with the Pope would simplify things, but this was medieval politics, where nothing came easy. In 799 AD, Pope Leo was in a bit of a pickle, facing charges from some unfriendly Roman nobles. Charlemagne, ever the opportunist, saw a chance to play the hero. He marched into Rome, sorted out the mess, and reinstalled Leo, which was basically the medieval equivalent of a political pat on the back. Then came the legendary moment of 800 AD, Charlemagne's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor. Imagine the scene. It's Christmas Day, St. Peter's Basilica is packed, and Charlemagne is kneeling before the Pope. Suddenly, Leo plops a crown on Charlemagne's head, declaring him the Emperor of the Romans. It was the PR coup of the century, but here's the kicker. Charlemagne claimed he had no idea it was going to happen, whether you believe that or not. It's the kind of plot twist that makes history so juicy. The irony of this coronation is thicker than a medieval stew. Charlemagne, a Frankish king, was now Emperor of the Romans, a title that had been as defunct as a Viking peace treaty for over 3 centuries. It was a masterstroke in rebranding, but it came with diplomatic headaches. The Byzantine Empire, which considered itself the rightful heir to Rome, wasn't too thrilled about this new emperor on the block. The title was supposed to unite Christendom, but it ended up being more of a medieval migraine, with Charlemagne having to balance the egos of popes, kings, and emperors like a political circus act. To add to the layers of intrigue, Charlemagne's coronation was as much about papal politics as it was about imperial ambition. Pope Leo Roman III needed a protector, and crowning Charlemagne was a strategic move to secure Frankish support. In return, Charlemagne got a shiny new title and the prestige that came with it, even if it meant navigating a diplomatic minefield. It was a classic case of you scratch my back, I'll crown your head. Charlemagne's coronation was both a dream and a nightmare. It elevated him to a status that few could rival, but it also tied him into the complex web of European politics. The title of Holy Roman Emperor was a medieval marketing triumph. It had also signaled a shift in power dynamics that would echo through the centuries. Charlemagne, ever the master of reinvention, had managed to transform his image from a Frankish king to a pan-European emperor. But as with all things in medieval history, the reality was far more tangled than the legend. As the dust settled on the coronation, Charlemagne's empire was at its zenith, a sprawling entity that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Yet, it was also a patchwork of cultures, languages, and loyalties, held together by the sheer force of Charlemagne's will. The dream of a unified Europe was tantalizingly close, but the reality was a constant juggling act of diplomacy, warfare, and administration. Charlemagne's personal life and political maneuvers were a mirror of the broader challenges he faced as a ruler. His marriages, children, and relationships with the papacy were all threads in the intricate tapestry of his reign. They reveal a man who was both a visionary and a pragmatist, capable of grand ambitions and grounded in the messy realities of medieval life. As we continue this saga, keep in mind that Charlemagne's story isn't just about the triumphs and titles. It's about the man behind the myth, a ruler who dared to dream big and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty in the process. The coronation might have been the crowning moment of his reign, but there's plenty more to explore in this epic tale of ambition, power, and the quest for a legacy that would last through the ages. Stay tuned, because the final chapter of Charlemagne's life is where the stakes get even higher and the drama unfolds in ways you won't want to miss. As Charlemagne stood at the peak of his power, crowned Holy Roman Emperor, the dream of a united Europe seemed within reach. But as any seasoned fan of history knows, empires are like soufflés, impressive when puffed up, but prone to deflating spectacularly. Charlemagne's grand vision was no different. After his death in 814 AD, the empire he labored to build didn't exactly crumble overnight, but it certainly developed a few cracks that would make any medieval architect wince. Let's be clear. Charlemagne's empire was a sprawling behemoth, covering much of Western Europe. It was a patchwork of territories that stretched from modern-day France and Germany to parts of Italy and beyond, a bit like trying to hold a family quilt together with only optimism and some very frayed thread. The challenge wasn't just in its size, but in the sheer diversity of its inhabitants. Different languages, laws, and customs meant that unifying this vast territory was akin to herding cats. Fierce, independent, occasionally rebellious cats. Charlemagne's death left a void that his son, Louis the Pious, struggled to fill. Louis inherited an empire that was as unwieldy as it was vast, and he lacked his father's knack for juggling the endless array of nobles, bishops, and bureaucrats. Louis's reign was plagued by internal strife and external threats, and he quickly found himself knee-deep in the medieval version of office politics, except instead of passive-aggressive emails, there were actual armies. By the time Louis shuffled off his mortal coil in 840 AD, the empire was teetering on the edge of chaos. It was left to his sons, Larair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, to sort out the mess. Spoiler alert, they didn't exactly form a harmonious boy band. If anything, they were more like a dysfunctional reality TV family, each one eyeing the biggest slice of the empire pie. This sibling rivalry culminated in the Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD, a document that officially split the empire into 3 distinct territories. Imagine trying to divide a pizza into 3 equal parts while blindfolded, and you'll have a sense of how well that went. The Treaty of Verdun was monumental, not just for its immediate impact, but for the reverberations it sent through European history. By carving up Charlemagne's creation, it set the stage for the centuries of squabbling that would define the continent's future. The western portion eventually evolved into modern-day France, the eastern section into Germany, and the middle section, well, it became a playground for conflict, a medieval no-man's land that offered more disputes than a border town saloon. The division of Charlemagne's empire was like watching a high-stakes game of musical chairs, where everyone ended up with a seat, but no one was particularly happy about it. It was a testament to the challenges of maintaining a vast empire in an era when communication was slower than a medieval postman with a hangover. The logistics were daunting, the politics were Byzantine, and the unity that Charlemagne had envisioned was more fragile than ever. Despite the fracturing of his empire, Charlemagne's legacy endured in ways that continue to shape Europe today. He wasn't just a king, he was a cultural icon, a symbol of ambition and unity that resonated long after his death. The myth of Charlemagne, this towering figure who could bend Europe to his will, was as much a product of medieval imagination as it was of historical fact. He was the stuff of legends, a medieval superhero whose story was retold with each generation, conveniently glossing over the messier details in favor of a more heroic narrative. But let's not get too starry-eyed. The reality was that Charlemagne's grand vision was, in many ways, a romantic ideal that ran headlong into the brick wall of medieval realpolitik. His empire's decline was a harsh reminder that even the most powerful rulers are at the mercy of time, circumstance, and the occasional rebellious noble. Yet the allure of his story, the dream of a unified Europe, the rise of a great emperor, the triumphs and tragedies of his reign, continues to captivate. Charlemagne's influence didn't stop with the borders of his empire. His reforms in education, administration, and culture laid the groundwork for the revival of learning that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance. His dream of a unified economic system hinted at the potential for a more interconnected Europe, a vision that echoes in today's European Union, albeit with fewer swords and more bureaucracy. In the end, Charlemagne's tale is one of ambition and complexity, a saga that defies simple categorization. He was a man who dared to dream big, to see beyond the fragmented politics of his time, and to imagine a Europe united under a single banner. It's a story that mixes romance with reality, myth with history, and leaves us pondering the enduring influence of one of history's most enigmatic figures. As we wrap up this journey through the life and legacy of Charlemagne, let's not forget the lessons his story offers. It's a reminder of the power of vision, the challenges of leadership, and the ever-present tension between idealism and pragmatism. Charlemagne's empire may have faded, but his impact endures, a testament to the timeless appeal of dreaming big, even when the odds are stacked against you. So, next time you're sipping a café au lait in Paris, or enjoying a bratwurst in Berlin, spare a thought for Charlemagne, the man who tried to unite a continent and left an indelible mark on the tapestry of history. It was in the middle of a marshy lagoon, with more water than solid ground, that a bunch of refugees decided to plant the seeds of what would become one of the most powerful republics in history. That's right, Venice, the city of canals, romance, and overpriced gondola rides, started as a soggy hideout for folks fleeing from invading hordes. Picture a group of bedraggled people arriving on these mosquito-infested islands around 421 AD. They weren't exactly the first to claim real estate in a place that could barely keep its head above water. But these early Venetians looked at this muddy mess and said, "Hey, let's make this work. You could say they were the original DIY enthusiasts. Instead of heading for higher ground, they dug in, literally. They drove wooden stakes into the marshy soil, creating a foundation stable enough to support buildings. Over time, they expanded these settlements into a series of connected islands, defying the odds and the elements. It's like building a skyscraper on quicksand and hoping for the best. But for the Venetians, it worked. By the 9th century, they transformed their watery backyard into a burgeoning trade center. Now, why would anyone choose to set up shop in a place where the ground was more liquid than solid? Well, turns out, being surrounded by water has its perks. For starters, it's a great natural defense. Invading armies can't just march across a lagoon, and naval attacks are a bit more complicated when your streets are canals. Plus, if you're in the business of trade, having a front row seat to the Adriatic Sea isn't too shabby. You're perfectly positioned to connect the East with the West, and that's exactly what Venice did. The Venetians quickly became the middlemen of the medieval world, trading everything from silk to spices. By the turn of the millennium, that scrappy group of lagoon dwellers had turned Venice into a commercial powerhouse. The city's population boomed, reaching around 60,000 by the year 1000, no small feat for a place built on stilts. This growth wasn't just about numbers, it was about influence. Venice became a republic, with its own elected leader, the Doge, who sat atop a government that was part oligarchy, part democracy, and all Venetian flair. But let's not kid ourselves. The story of Venice isn't just a tale of triumph. It's also one of cunning, opportunism, and let's face it, a fair bit of ruthlessness. Sure, there's a romantic notion of a city rising from the waters, but the reality was a little murkier. The early Venetians were shrewd businessmen who weren't above bending the rules to get ahead. They played European powers against each other, striking deals with both the Byzantine Empire and the Frankish kingdom, all while maintaining their independence. Venice was, in many ways, the Switzerland of its day, neutral, but always ready to make a profit. Their knack for trade was matched by their talent for diplomacy, and when necessary, a bit of subterfuge. In 1082, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, desperate for help against the Normans, granted Venice significant trading privileges in exchange for military support. The Venetians got to trade throughout the empire, free of customs duties, which was like winning the medieval lottery. This deal was a game changer, solidifying Venice's role as a dominant trading power. Yet, even as they built their empire on trade, the Venetians never lost sight of their unique origins. They were a people forged by adversity, and that tenacity became a defining characteristic. While Venice's reputation as a city of canals and captivating architecture is well-deserved, its true legacy lies in its ability to adapt and thrive against the odds. From its humble beginnings as a refuge for the displaced, Venice emerged as a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. The lagoon, once a barrier, became a bridge, connecting cultures, economies, and histories in ways that few could have anticipated. And here's a little myth-busting for you. The idea that Venice was built from nothing is a bit of an exaggeration. Sure, they started in a swamp, but they didn't do it all alone. The early Venetians were savvy networkers, leveraging relationships and resources from the mainland to bolster their fledgling city. They weren't isolated pioneers. They were connected, strategic, and knew how to play the long game. Their success wasn't an accident. It was a calculated gamble that paid off spectacularly. So, the next time you find yourself marveling at the beauty of Venice, remember, it was built on more than just wooden stakes and watery foundations. It was built on ambition, strategy, and a fair bit of luck. The rise of the Venetian Republic is a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. From a swamp to a powerhouse, Venice's story is one of transformation, proving that even the most inhospitable environments can become a cradle of innovation and power. As we wade deeper into the Venetian saga, let's unravel the intricacies that turned a marshy backwater into the medieval world's equivalent of Wall Street. Picture Venice as a city-state with the uncanny ability to be both everywhere and nowhere at the same time. A master of trade and intrigue that kept the rest of Europe on its toes, all while laughing its way to the bank. First up, let's talk about spices. No, not the kind you sprinkle on your avocado toast. We're talking about the medieval gold, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, luxuries that had nobles salivating and merchants scheming. Venice was the undisputed hub of this lucrative trade, sitting pretty at the crossroads of East and West. By the 13th century, this watery city controlled the spice routes that snaked their way from the exotic markets of the Levant to the palatial kitchens of Europe. But how, you ask, did they pull off such economic wizardry? Well, the Venetians were no strangers to a good hustle. They leveraged their strategic geographic position like a grandmaster chess player. The city's location in the Adriatic Sea was the perfect launching pad for ships bound for the Byzantine Empire, the Arab world, and beyond. Venice became the middleman extraordinaire, buying spices in bulk from the east and selling them at a hefty markup in the west. It was like buying wholesale at Trader Joe's and selling at Whole Foods prices. Now, let's sprinkle in some concrete numbers to spice things up. By the 14th century, an estimated 1,000 Venetian merchant ships were plying the seas, an impressive fleet for a city-state of only 100,000 souls. They weren't just ferrying spices, though. Venice had its fingers in every pie, from silk to precious metals. The Republic's annual revenue from trade, a staggering 6 million gold ducats by some accounts. That's enough to make even Scrooge McDuck blush. But here's the kicker. While the rest of Europe was busy with knights and castles, Venice was perfecting the art of commerce and finance. The Venetians pioneered the use of bonds to raise capital, a nifty trick that allowed them to fund their expansive trade networks without draining their coffers. They also developed early forms of insurance, safeguarding their precious cargoes against the treacherous whims of the sea. In essence, Venice was the medieval world's financial innovator, a Silicon Valley in a time of swords and sandals. Of course, with great power comes not-so-great rivals. Genoa, Venice's maritime arch-nemesis, was constantly snapping at its heels. The two city-states engaged in a series of brutal conflicts known as the Venetian-Genoese Wars. Picture this: naval battles with towering galleys, ruthless blockades, and a mutual loathing that could rival any modern corporate feud. But despite the constant threat, Venice managed to outmaneuver Genoa time and again, proving that cunning and strategy could beat sheer might. One of Venice's secret weapons was its ability to play politics like a maestro. The Venetians had a knack for making friends in high places, and enemies too, when it suited their agenda. They struck deals with the Mongols, who controlled the overland Silk Road routes, ensuring a steady flow of goods. And they weren't above a bit of subterfuge either. In the Fourth Crusade of 1204, the Venetians famously redirected a band of crusaders to sack Constantinople, their Byzantine allies, instead of the Holy Land. This move wasn't just a historical plot twist. It was a strategic coup that expanded Venice's influence and wealth. But let's not romanticize Venice's rise as merely a tale of shrewd dealings and mercantile genius. The Republic was also adept at playing dirty. They imposed strict regulations on their own merchants, ensuring that profits flowed back to Venice and not into the pockets of individual traders. The Venetian state, ever the puppet master, controlled the trade routes with an iron grip, like the Godfather making offers no one could refuse. And while we're debunking myths, let's dispel the notion that Venice's success was solely built on trade. The city-state was also a formidable military power, with a navy that was the envy of Europe. The arsenal of Venice, a sprawling shipyard complex, could churn out a galley in a matter of days, a feat of industrial efficiency that would make Henry Ford do a double-take. This military might allow Venice to protect its trade routes and expand its territories, ensuring that the flow of goods and gold never stopped. Yet there's a flip side to this glittering coin. Venice's wealth was built on the backs of the many, not the few. The city was a melting pot of cultures and classes, from the noble patricians who ruled the roost to the laborers who toiled in the shipyards. The latter reaped few rewards from the city's prosperity, a stark reminder that even in a republic, equality was more of a dream than a reality. As Venice's influence grew, so did its ambitions. The city expanded its reach into the Mediterranean, seizing key ports and islands to secure its trade routes. By the 15th century, Venice controlled a maritime empire that stretched from the Adriatic to the Aegean. This wasn't just about commerce. It was about power, pure, unadulterated power. Venice had transformed from a soggy refuge into a formidable force, its influence felt from the Ottoman Empire to the courts of Europe. In the end, the Venetian Republic was a masterclass in adaptation and innovation. It was a city that thrived on contradictions, both a beacon of democracy and a bastion of elitism, a hub of culture and a center of commerce. Venice was a place where art and money danced a delicate waltz, each feeding off the other in a symphony of opulence and ambition. So, as we close this chapter on Venice's economic wizardry, remember, the city's rise was no fairy tale. It was a tale of grit and guile, of profits and power, of a people who turned a lagoon into a legend. And while the story of Venice is far from over, it's a reminder that sometimes the most improbable beginnings can lead to the most extraordinary empires. Stay tuned, because the next act in Venice's grand drama is just around the corner. As Venice's story unfolds, it's clear that the city's prowess wasn't just confined to the spice-laden holds of its ships or the clinking ducats in its coffers. The real game was played in the shadowy corridors of power, where the Venetians demonstrated a knack for diplomacy that would make even the most seasoned political operators blush. You see, while other city-states were busy sharpening their swords, Venice was perfecting the art of the handshake deal. Let's start with the basics. Venice was a republic, but not in the way we imagine today. Forget about any notions of egalitarianism or universal suffrage. The Venetian government was a club for the elite, and membership wasn't open to just anyone. The Doge, the elected head honcho, was more figurehead than king, with real power residing in the hands of the Great Council, a body that was as exclusive as a members-only speakeasy in Prohibition-era Chicago. By the 12th century, this council was composed of around 200 members, all drawn from the city's leading families. Talk about keeping it in the family. But here's the kicker. This oligarchic setup was Venice's secret weapon. It ensured stability and continuity, crucial in a world where political upheavals were as common as bad hair days. The Great Council operated like a well-oiled machine, balancing the interests of powerful families and preventing any one faction from seizing too much control. In a world where kings and emperors rose and fell with alarming regularity, Venice's steady hand was like a beacon of reliability. Now, let's talk about Venice's diplomatic toolkit, a veritable Swiss Army knife of political maneuvering. The city was adept at playing its neighbors against each other, ensuring that no single power could dominate the region. In the 14th century, while Milan was busy trying to expand its territory, Venice was busy cozying up to its rivals, forging alliances that kept the Milanese ambitions in check. It was like watching a master poker player bluff their way to victory, all while keeping a straight face. And then there was espionage. Oh, yes, the Venetians weren't above a bit of cloak and dagger action. They maintained an extensive network of spies throughout Europe, gathering intelligence that would make a modern-day CIA operative jealous. Venice was the original information economy. Long before Silicon Valley turned data into dollars, the Venetians were using it to outmaneuver their rivals. Take, for instance, the infamous Council of Ten, a shadowy committee established in 1310 with the mandate to protect the Republic's security. Think of it as Venice's version of MI6, only with more intrigue and fewer gadgets. The Council of Ten wielded enormous power, operating in secrecy and with little oversight. They were the guardians of the state, ensuring that Venice's enemies, both foreign and domestic, were kept in check. If Venice was a ship, the Council of Ten was the rudder, steering it through the choppy waters of international politics. But let's not forget the softer side of diplomacy, the strategic marriage. When swords and treaties failed, Venice wasn't too proud to send a daughter or two to the altar to seal the deal. These unions were less about love and more about leverage, binding Venice to powerful families across Europe. It was matrimonial diplomacy at its finest, ensuring that the city had friends in high places, or at least in laws with influence. Take the 14th century marriage between the Venetian noblewoman Caterina Cornaro and King James Roman II of Cyprus. This wasn't just a union. It was a power play that extended Venice's influence into the eastern Mediterranean. When James conveniently died a few years later, Caterina became the queen regent, and Venice effectively controlled Cyprus. It was like a medieval version of Game of Thrones, minus the dragons. Now, if you're thinking that Venice's diplomatic finesse was all sunshine and rainbows, think again. This was a city that knew how to play hardball. The Venetians could be ruthless when necessary, imposing economic blockades on uncooperative neighbors, or using their formidable navy to remind the world who ruled the waves. Think of it as a carrot and stick approach, with the carrot being Venetian gold and the stick being a fleet of galleys. Let's not romanticize this, though. Venice's diplomatic success was built on a foundation of hard-nosed pragmatism. The city knew how to pick its battles, avoiding costly wars whenever possible, and instead opting for strategies that maximized gain while minimizing risk. In a world where might often made right, Venice thrived by knowing when to fight and when to talk. But here's a myth worth debunking: the idea that Venice was an island of peace in a sea of chaos. While the city was indeed a master of diplomacy, it was also an active participant in the power struggles of the day. Venice's involvement in the Fourth Crusade, where it redirected the Crusaders to sack Constantinople, is a prime example. This wasn't a case of benign neutrality. It was a calculated move that brought Venice wealth and territorial gains at the expense of an ally. So much for the idea of a peaceful republic. As we delve deeper into the political machinations of Venice, it's clear that the city's success was no accident. It was the result of a careful balancing act, a tightrope walk across the chasm of European politics. Venice was a city that understood the value of alliances and the power of information, a city that could charm and coerce with equal skill. It was a republic that thrived on contradictions, a place where diplomacy and espionage, charm and cunning walked hand in hand. So, as we navigate the labyrinth of Venice's political landscape, remember, this was a city that knew how to play the game, a city that turned diplomacy into an art form. And while the story of Venice's rise is one of ambition and ingenuity, it's also a tale of power and pragmatism, of a city that mastered the art of survival in a world where the stakes were as high as the towers of the Doge Palace. Stay tuned, because the next chapter in Venice's saga promises even more intrigue and ambition. As we peek behind the velvet curtains of Venice's political stage, let's shift our gaze from the machinations of the elite to the social tapestry of this canal-woven marvel. Picture the city as a grand opera, where the Doge Palace is the glittering stage and the narrow alleyways serve as the bustling backstage. But beneath the gilded masks of carnival revelry, the reality of Venetian society was a bit more real-life drama than storybook fantasy. First, let's talk about the Doge Palace, the architectural embodiment of Venetian opulence. This wasn't just a building, it was a billboard for the Republic's wealth and power. Built in the Venetian Gothic style, it showcased intricate stonework and lavish interiors, enough to make any visiting dignitary green with envy. Yet behind the marble facade, the Doge himself was less a monarch and more a glorified public servant. Elected for life, he was shackled by checks and balances that'd make a modern bureaucrat weep. Fancy living in a palace, but having less personal freedom than your average Renaissance fair juggler. Welcome to the life of a Doge. Meanwhile, the true pulse of Venice beat in its marketplaces. Imagine a cacophony of dialects and the clatter of commerce, where merchants hawked everything from exotic spices to fine silks. Rialto, the city's commercial hub, was a melting pot of cultures and classes. Think Wall Street meets the Silk Road. Here, wealth flowed like the waters of the Grand Canal, but not everyone was invited to the party. Venetian society was as stratified as a layered tiramisu, with a rigid class structure that kept the patricians perched comfortably atop. Let's debunk the myth of Venice as a utopia of equality. The city's patrician class, a tight-knit group of about 2,000 families, held the reins of power with a grip tighter than a gondolier's on his pole. They ran the Senate, held the most lucrative trade licenses, and controlled the lion's share of wealth. Meanwhile, the popolani, or common folk, lived in the shadows of the palazzi, their labor fueling the city's prosperity, but their voices often drowned out by the patrician chorus. And yet, the social fabric of Venice was more than a tale of haves and have-nots. It was a city of paradoxes, where the lines between classes could blur, if only slightly. Wealthy merchants could buy their way into the lower echelons of the nobility, and occasionally a savvy artisan might climb the social ladder. But don't get too excited. These were the exceptions, not the rule. For most, social mobility was about as fluid as the solid footing of a Venetian street. Let's put some numbers on it. By the 16th century, Venice boasted a population of around 180 000, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. Yet, only a fraction of these inhabitants enjoyed the privileges of citizenship. And here's a fun fact. The Venetian Republic operated a census every few years, not just to count heads, but to check who was eligible to wield political power. Spoiler alert, if you weren't born into the right family, your chances were slimmer than a gondola's silhouette at sunset. But let's not forget the role of the church in this social tapestry. Venice was as much a city of churches as it was of canals. St. Mark's Basilica, with its Byzantine mosaics and opulent altars, was the spiritual heart of the Republic. Yet, in true Venetian style, even religion was a bit of a business. Church offices could be bought and sold, and the wealthier families often held positions of influence within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, a divine mix of faith and finance. Speaking of divine, let's address the myth of the Venetian carnival as a symbol of unbridled freedom. Sure, for a few weeks each year, the city donned its masks, and social barriers seemed to melt away in a haze of revelry. But beneath the masquerade, the rigid hierarchy remained unyielding. Carnival was less a revolution and more a release valve, a chance for the populace to let off steam before returning to the daily grind. Think of it as the world's fanciest costume party, where everyone pretended to be someone else for a night, only to wake up the next day in the same social strata. Now, let's talk about the everyday life of the average Venetian. Housing was a mixed bag. Noble families occupied grand palazzi along the Grand Canal, while the working class squeezed into cramped, multi-story houses called lofts. If you were a laborer or a craftsman, your home was likely a modest affair, with more family members than rooms. But what these homes lacked in size, they made up for in community spirit. Neighborhoods, or sestri, were tight-knit, with lively markets, bustling taverns, and the ever-present sound of gossip as the city's soundtrack. One of the most fascinating aspects of Venetian society was its approach to social welfare. The scuole grandi, or great schools, were charitable institutions run by lay members of the community. They provided everything from medical care to dowries for poor girls, a testament to the city's communal ethos. These organizations were a lifeline for the less fortunate, ensuring that even in a city of stark divisions, a safety net existed. Of course, let's not overlook the role of women in this society. Contrary to some romanticized depictions, women in Venice were not merely decorative figures. Noblewomen wielded influence through strategic marriages and social networks, while women of the working class contributed to the economy as shopkeepers, textile workers, and even gondoliers. Yes, women rowers were a thing, though not as common as their male counterparts. But here's a reality check. Women were still second-class citizens in many respects. Their legal rights were limited, and their autonomy often curtailed by societal norms. Yet, within these constraints, they found ways to assert their presence, whether through household management or participation in religious and charitable activities. It was a society where women's power was often subtle, but nonetheless significant. As for the darker underbelly of Venetian life, crime and corruption were never far from the surface. The city's wealth and cosmopolitan nature made it a magnet for smugglers, thieves, and all manner of ne'er-do-wells. The infamous Bridge of Sighs, connecting the Doge Palace to the prisons, was a poignant reminder of justice's heavy hand. Yet, for all its criminality, Venice was remarkably stable, a testament to the Republic's effective, if sometimes draconian, governance. As we navigate the canals of Venetian society, it's clear that this was a city of contrasts and contradictions, a place where elegance and grit coexisted, where the shimmering facade often masked the complex reality beneath. The story of Venice is not just one of grand palaces and powerful patricians, but of the everyday people who lived, worked, and dreamed within its watery embrace. In the next act of our Venetian saga, we'll delve deeper into the city's economic strategies, exploring how this floating empire managed to maintain its dominance amidst the shifting tides of European politics. So, stay tuned as we continue to unravel the intricate weave of Venice's history, because in this city of water and stone, there's always another layer to discover. As we embark on the final leg of our journey through the canals of Venetian history, get ready for a roller coaster ride, a gondola ride, if you will, through the rise and inevitable fall of this once mighty republic. At its peak, Venice was a dazzling blend of opulence and ambition, Yet even the most splendorous cities must contend with change. The Venetian Republic, much like that overconfident friend who never sees the plot twist coming, found itself gradually eclipsed by the shifting tides of European power. By the 16th century, Venice was still riding high on its maritime empire, but the winds of change were already picking up speed. The age of exploration was in full swing, and those pesky Portuguese had just found a sea route to India, bypassing the Venetian monopoly on eastern goods. Suddenly, spices weren't filtering through Venetian hands, and the city's coffers began to feel the pinch. It's like discovering your favorite artisanal coffee shop has been replaced by a generic chain, only with global trade stakes. To make matters worse, Venice's rivals were getting bolder. The Ottomans, with their expanding empire, were becoming the dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean. In 1571, the Battle of Lepanto saw a rare victory for Venice and its allies against the Turks, but the writing was on the wall. The Ottomans controlled key trade routes and ports, squeezing Venice out of its own backyard. It was as if Venice was playing chess, while the Ottomans had switched to speed chess. Economically, Venice was trapped in a high-stakes game of catch-up. The city tried to pivot, investing in land-based ventures in northern Italy and modernizing its industries. The renowned Murano glassmakers, for instance, kept the fires burning with innovations that dazzled Europe. Yet, for all its efforts, Venice was like an aging rock star trying to keep pace with the new kids on the block, still relevant, but no longer setting the trends. Politically, the Republic faced internal challenges as well. The once tight-knit oligarchic structure began to show cracks. With fewer spoils from trade to distribute, tensions arose among the patrician families. The Great Council, once a bastion of stability, became a theater of infighting and intrigue. Venice was still a republic on paper, but the reality was more Game of Thrones than West Wing. In a desperate bid to maintain its influence, Venice turned inward, becoming more insular and conservative. By the 17th century, the city that once welcomed merchants and traders from around the globe was closing its doors. The famed Venetian diplomacy, once its greatest asset, had given way to suspicion and paranoia. It was as if the city had aged into a grumpy old man, yelling at the world to keep off its lawn. By the 18th century, the Venetian Republic was limping towards its finale. The Napoleonic Wars delivered the final blow. In 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte, with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, marched into Venice, effectively ending more than a millennium of independence. The Treaty of Campo Formio handed the city over to the Austrian Empire, and Venice's days as a sovereign state were over. Picture a grand opera coming to an abrupt end, with the curtains falling mid-area. Yet, for all its decline, legacy of Venice endures like a timeless melody. The city left an indelible mark on the cultural and commercial landscape of Europe. Venetian art, music, and architecture continue to inspire, a testament to the city's enduring allure. The works of Titian, Bellini, and Tintoretto still captivate audiences, while Vivaldi's compositions echo through concert halls worldwide. Venice may have lost its political clout, but its cultural influence remains as potent as ever. Economically, Venice was a trailblazer long after its trade dominance waned. The Republic's innovations in finance and commerce laid the groundwork for modern capitalism. Venetian merchants were among the first to issue government bonds, a system that today underpins global financial markets. The city's mastery of maritime law and contracts influenced legal systems far beyond its watery borders, proving that sometimes the most lasting legacies are written in the ink of contracts, not just the annals of history. And let's not forget the city itself, a marvel of human ingenuity that continues to draw millions to its canals and cobblestone streets. Venice is a monument to the power of human perseverance, a city built on water that defies the elements even as it slowly succumbs to them. The romance of Venice, with its labyrinthine alleyways and shimmering reflections, persists as a symbol of beauty and resilience. So, as we conclude our Venetian saga, let's remember this. Venice was more than a city. It was an idea, a testament to what humanity can achieve when ambition meets adversity. From its humble beginnings in a mosquito-ridden swamp to its rise as a global powerhouse, Venice's story is one of transformation and triumph. It's a reminder that even the most improbable beginnings can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes, and that sometimes The real legends are the ones built not on dry land, but on dreams and determination. In the end, the Venetian Republic may have slipped beneath the waves of history, but its spirit sails on, a ghostly galleon navigating the seas of memory. And as we drift away from its storied shores, let's tip our hats to the city that turned a lagoon into a legacy, proving that, in the grand tapestry of history, the most brilliant threads are often the ones woven with both romance and reality.